Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Devils in Michigan. It's strange, isn't it? How you can be so sure of something, yet still feel the unease in the pit of your stomach, as though something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it. I've been trying to figure that out ever since I came to this godforsaken town. I never wanted to come here. But when you lose everything, when you lose her, it's like the world suddenly closes in on you. I thought I was running from the pain. Michigan was supposed to be my escape, just a place to forget, to let the sorrow fade into the landscape of nothingness. But now I'm beginning to think that some places are meant to be forgotten for a reason. I remember the first time I set foot in this town, the Hollow of the Marsh, they call it. It's located deep in the swampy heart of Michigan, isolated from the world by miles of untamed wetlands. There are only a few homes here, and most of the people who live here don't stick around long enough to make much of an impression. They're all like ghosts, fading into the background. There's a strange sense of silence that hangs in the air, like the place itself is holding its breath. And I thought that was all there was to it. Just a quiet little town, too far out to be of any real importance. But then people started disappearing. I didn't know that at first, of course. When I arrived, the town seemed ordinary enough. Small streets lined with old houses, gas stations that still sold cigarettes for a few bucks, and the occasional truck rumbling past. But soon I began hearing rumors. Whispers in the local bar, from the shopkeepers. Disappearances. At first, I thought they were just stories, the kind people tell to scare outsiders. But there was something in the way they spoke, low voices, eyes shifting nervously, that made me feel like there was more to it. It wasn't until I started asking around that I heard the truth. The locals claimed that it wasn't just people who went missing. It was something worse. Something that lurked in the swamps. They're not human, one of the older men had told me, leaning close, his breath smelling of whiskey. They're devils. The ones that walk in the marsh. Don't go too far out, boy. You'll never come back. I shook it off at first. Some old man, probably just trying to scare me, I thought. But then the noises started. I was staying in an old house on the edge of the town, alone. The house wasn't much, just a worn-down cabin with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew in the air. But it was peaceful. Quiet. I thought it would give me the space I needed to think, to heal. But every night, I would hear it. A scratching sound. A distant, rhythmic noise that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling. But it went on for hours. Sometimes it sounded like nails scraping across wood, other times like something heavy dragging across the floor. It was coming from beneath the house. The crawl space, where the foundation was low, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But I could feel it. There was something down there. Watching. Waiting. One evening, after yet another night of disturbed sleep, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight, feeling foolish as I crouched down next to the hatch leading to the crawl space. The air was heavy, thick with moisture. As I opened the hatch, A cold draft swept up from beneath the house, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rot. The flashlight flickered as I shone into the dark, the beam barely cutting through the thick shadows below. I could hear it again. The scratching. It was closer now, as if whatever was down there had noticed my presence. A chill ran up my spine. I hesitated. But then my curiosity won out, and I lowered myself into the crawl space, the narrow opening barely wide enough for me to fit through. The moment I descended into the darkness, I felt it, something was wrong. The air was still, too still. And then, as my flashlight scanned the shadows, I saw them. Tracks. Massive, deep gouges in the dirt, as if something had dragged itself across the floor. The marks were fresh, and they led off into the darkness, disappearing into the blackness ahead. But that wasn't the worst part. There were other signs, too. The remnants of shredded fabric, bits of broken wood, and a trail of something darker, thicker than dirt. Something wet. I heard a noise. Soft, but distinct. A rustle. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. And then, just as I turned to leave, I saw them. Eyes. Red, glowing eyes, watching me from the far end of the crawl space. A hiss. The unmistakable sound of something shifting in the dark. I didn't wait to see more. I scrambled out of the crawl space, my heart hammering in my chest, the flashlight dropping to the floor and illuminating nothing but the cold emptiness beneath the house. I slammed the hatch shut behind me and stumbled back into the cabin, my mind racing. What were those eyes? What was down there? I tried to convince myself it was just a raccoon or some other animal. But I knew better. I could still feel them, those eyes, locked on me from the darkness. Something was down there. And whatever it wasn't alone. It wasn't long before I began hearing the whispers again. Those same rumors from the townspeople. The ones about the devils in the swamp. And for the first time since I arrived, I began to wonder if maybe they were right. Something was living under the earth here. Something ancient, something hungry. And it was getting closer. It's strange how quickly a place can change. What was once just a quiet town, tucked away in the marshes of Michigan, now felt suffocating. My cabin, once a sanctuary from the chaos of my life, now felt like a trap. The silence that had seemed so peaceful at first now weighed heavy on my chest. The swamp outside wasn't the serene backdrop I had imagined. It had become a looming presence, a dark force that seemed to watch me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, just beyond the tree-line, in the shadows. The scratching noise beneath the floorboards continued. Each night it grew louder, more insistent. The sound was always the same, a slow, deliberate scrape, followed by a strange thumping, like something, or someone, was pacing back and forth beneath the house. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, the wind, maybe even animals scavenging in the crawl space. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing about this place was simple. I hadn't told anyone about what I'd seen in the crawl space. Not the tracks, not the eyes. I didn't want to seem crazy. But the more time I spent alone in that cabin, the more my mind unraveled. The locals had been right. This town wasn't like other places. There was something here, something ancient, something that had been buried in the earth for longer than I could understand. And it was awakening. It was on the third night after my crawl space encounter when the town's eerie isolation started to feel dangerous. I had been avoiding the streets during the late hours, too afraid to venture after the sun set. But that night, I had to get something from the gas station, the last of the supplies I had left before I'd be completely stuck here. I needed answers, and I thought maybe someone at the station could give me one. I didn't know what I expected when I stepped outside. The fog had rolled in, thick and impenetrable, blanketing the streets in an oppressive silence. It clung to the ground like a living thing, and the air felt wet, cold, and stagnant. The road stretched out ahead of me, shrouded in mist, as I made my way down the long path to the gas station. Every step I took seemed to echo, every sound swallowed by the fog. I thought I saw something move ahead of me, just a flicker, like a shadow darting between the trees. But when I stopped and looked, there was nothing. The air felt too still, too thick with anticipation. I kept walking, my boots crunching softly on the gravel path, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my stomach. As I approached the gas station, I saw a figure standing just outside. An old man, hunched over with a faded cap pulled low over his eyes. His back was turned to me, but I could tell he was watching me, even though he didn't move. It was as if he was waiting for something, watching the road for a sign. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The fog seemed to swallow the sound, stretching it thin until it barely reached him. The man didn't turn around. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice raspy, almost as if he was speaking from somewhere deep underground. "Why?" I asked, instinctively taking a step back. He turned then, slowly, as though the movement pained him. His eyes were wide, too wide. They gleamed in the dark, reflecting the faint light from the gas station sign. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Those eyes, they weren't right. "You've seen them," he said, his words a low, gravelly whisper. "Haven't you?" I nodded before I could stop myself. The eyes? In the crawl space? Where are they? He leaned in, close enough that I could smell the rancid scent of old smoke and sweat on his clothes. "They aren't just eyes. They're the eyes of things that were here long before you or me. Things that lived under the earth. You've been marked now, boy. They know you're here. And they won't stop until they get you." I shook my head. "What are you talking about? What are these things?" The old man's smile was twisted, like it didn't quite belong on his face. "The devils. They call them devils because that's what they are. They'll leave you alone if you don't go near them. But once they know you've seen them, they'll come for you." I took a step back, my heart racing. "No, this is insane. I've been hearing things, seeing things, but that's just my mind. It's not real." His laugh was low, almost a growl. "You think you're the first one? Think again. People come here all the time. They hear the stories, they see the signs. But the ones who really see, who know the truth, they're the ones who never leave." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? The fog around us seemed to close in even tighter, the air heavier with every breath. I tried to step around him, but his hand shot out and grabbed my arm, his grip stronger than I would have thought for someone so frail. "Don't go into the marsh. Don't go looking for them. You'll regret it." He released me abruptly, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I turned and ran back toward my cabin, not looking back even once. That night, as I lay in bed, the scratching began again. But this time, it wasn't beneath the floor. It was coming from the walls. The faint, slow scrape of claws dragging across the wood. And then I heard it, soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice. A whisper. "I see you." I froze. The air in the room turned cold, biting, and the scratching grew louder. It was all around me now, coming from every direction, as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the dark. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to breathe. But I had to. And as I slowly turned my head, I saw something move in the shadows. A shape, darker than the night, shifting just out of sight. The eyes. They were back. And this time, they weren't alone. I had barely managed to sleep, if you could call it that. The cold air that had crept into my cabin made my bones ache. Every shadow felt like it was alive, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. But what was worse was the feeling that had settled into my chest, the certainty that something was waiting for me, just out of sight, somewhere in the dark corners of my mind. The scratching continued throughout the night, louder now, more urgent. It wasn't just the walls this time, it was the floor, the ceiling, even the windows, as if whatever it was, had surrounded me. The sound of claws scraping against wood echoed like a dreadful symphony, filling the silence of the night. I could feel it creeping closer, inch by inch. I needed to get out. The isolation was breaking me. The fog had thickened the next morning, the air heavy with a sense of impending doom. I couldn't shake the feeling that the town was closing in around me. The locals, the strange stories, the eyes in the dark, they were all connected. I knew it deep down. I stepped outside in a daze, the mist clinging to my skin like a second layer. The town, still asleep, felt like a ghost town. There wasn't a single soul in sight. I walked down the road toward the gas station, my mind racing. The man's warning echoed in my ears. Don't go into the marsh. Don't go looking for them. But I didn't know how to ignore it. The need to understand, to find answers, was growing unbearable. And maybe, just maybe, if I could figure out what was happening, I could escape it. As I passed the abandoned house at the end of the street, something caught my eye, a flash of movement, too quick to be anything natural. I turned sharply, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought I saw a figure standing by the trees, just beyond the clearing. A man? No, too tall, too dark, a shadow stretching unnaturally along the ground. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. My mind raced as I squinted through the mist, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could take another step, it disappeared into the woods. I should have turned back then. I should have run. But something inside me kept me moving forward. The gas station was close now, and the fleeting glimpse of the figure had left me more shaken than I wanted to admit. I arrived at the station breathless, my legs shaking beneath me. The old man was still there, standing by the door. His expression hadn't changed. It was as though he'd been waiting for me all along. He didn't speak when I approached, but I could feel his eyes following me, seeing things I didn't want to admit. "You came looking for answers," he said, his voice low, almost sorrowful. "But you won't like what you find." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words felt like they were stuck in my throat. I needed to get away, to get back to my cabin, but I couldn't tear myself away from him. Something about his presence, his certainty, was magnetic. He stepped closer, leaning in. His breath smelled of decay. "They'll come for you. The devils, the ones from the marsh. They know you're here. And you've already seen them, haven't you?" I nodded. I didn't want to, but I couldn't lie to him. The eyes, the whispers, they were real. The fear that had been gnawing at my insides felt suffocating now. The old man's face softened. You should have left when you had the chance. But now, you're part of it. And it won't stop until it gets you. I didn't understand. What did he mean? Part of it? The man stepped back, turning toward the gas station. There's no escape, he muttered, more to himself than to me. The eyes will follow you, always. I felt a cold, sickening wave of dread sweep over me. I didn't know what he meant by those words, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I turned on my heel, rushing back toward the road, back toward the safety of my cabin. But as I walked, the familiar path seemed different now, as if the earth itself had shifted. The trees loomed taller, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the fog had grown thicker, almost suffocating. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I couldn't shake it. I quickened my pace, my breath shallow, desperate. Every rustle in the underbrush, every creak of the trees sent a jolt of terror through my spine. When I finally reached the clearing by my cabin, I froze. There, standing just beyond the trees, were two glowing eyes. They pierced through the fog like twin beacons, unblinking, unyielding. They were the same eyes I had seen in the crawl space, the ones that had haunted my every thought. But now, they were closer, so much closer. They moved slowly, like they were savoring every moment, every step I took closer to them. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no escape. The eyes followed me, unblinking, unrelenting. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The fog swallowed them up, leaving nothing behind but the emptiness. But I knew that they weren't gone. They were still out there, waiting. And soon, they would come for me. I turned and ran, the panic rising in my throat, choking me. My feet pounded against the earth as I made my way back to the cabin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. When I reached the door, I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was out there, whatever those eyes belonged to, they would find me. I pressed my back against the door, breathing heavily. The house was silent for a moment. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of scratching. It was closer now. Much closer. The walls seemed to tremble with each scrape of claws. And then, I heard the whisper. I see you. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The whisper, soft but unmistakable, echoed in my mind like a sickening lullaby. I see you. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even close. The walls trembled again, the scratching more deliberate now, like someone was trying to claw its way inside. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. I pressed my back harder against the door, as if doing so could make the tremors stop. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. The scratching wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was coming from underneath. The floorboards creaked, and I could feel something shifting beneath me, something massive, something alive. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would burst out of my chest. I forced myself to think. What could I do? Where could I go? The windows were too small to escape through. The door, locked as it was, wasn't safe. If whatever was out there wanted to get in, it would. There was no stopping it. I have to find out what this is. The thought came to me suddenly, almost against my will. Some twisted curiosity, drove me forward. I didn't know what was worse anymore, facing the unknown outside or staying trapped inside with the thing that had already found me. But it didn't matter now. I needed answers. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and moved toward the back door. I paused for a moment, my hand on the handle, listening. The whispering grew louder, though still incomprehensible. Then, as if in reply, a low, guttural growl rumbled from beneath the floor. It was like the earth itself was alive, and it was angry. I opened the door. A wave of cold air hit me instantly, the kind of cold that felt wrong, unnatural. It wasn't the chill of the night or the mist, it was the kind of cold that clung to your skin and seeped into your bones. I stepped out onto the porch, the flashlight beam cutting through the fog. It was thick now, almost solid, swirling like smoke. I could barely make out the path leading into the woods. The trees, black silhouettes against the gray sky, looked twisted and distorted in the mist, as though the very land had been corrupted. I could feel something pulling me toward them, beckoning me to follow. Don't do it. The thought came from somewhere deep within me, but it was too late. My feet were already moving, dragging me forward. I couldn't resist. I walked toward the trees, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The air grew heavier with each step, and the growl beneath the cabin's floor grew louder, as though something was moving beneath me, just inches away. I felt as though the ground itself was alive, breathing in time with me. The path was narrow, winding, disappearing into the mist. As I moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick, damp, and filled with the stench of rot, like the marsh itself was decaying. My skin crawled with every step. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. And then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of scraping claws against wood, the same sound I had heard inside the cabin. But this time it was louder, sharper, coming from above me, from the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, the flashlight now shaking violently in my grip. A figure, no, not a figure, but a shape, shifted among the trees. It was massive, towering over me, its limbs long and unnatural. The shape flickered in and out of the darkness, like smoke, like a shadow. Its eyes, those glowing eyes, appeared again, cutting through the fog, but this time they weren't just watching. They were tracking me, following every move I made. I tried to step back, but my legs felt like lead, heavy and unyielding. The shadows seemed to grow, stretching toward me with a terrifying speed. The air crackled with a presence I couldn't understand. It was as if the very trees were alive, as if they were part of whatever was coming for me. Suddenly, the whisper was in my ear again. I see you. The voice was close, too close. It was a hiss, a breath in the night. I spun around, but no one was there. The flashlight's beam flickered, and the mist closed in around me, thick and suffocating. Panic surged through me. I had to get away. I turned to run, but the sound of scratching, closer now, faster, was behind me, following me with every frantic step I took. The shape in the trees was still there, moving, shifting, its eyes burning through the fog. I stumbled through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes, the ground uneven and slick beneath my feet. But the more I ran, the closer the noise came. It was like the world was collapsing in on me, the trees themselves reaching for me, trying to pull me down. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. My breath came in ragged gasps, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw only the glowing eyes, getting closer, closer. Then I tripped, falling hard to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, its beam cutting across the dark forest floor before flickering out. Silence. The growling stopped. The scratching stopped. Even the whispering was gone. But the eyes, they were still there. I picked myself up, trembling, trying to steady my breath. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. And then, just as quickly as the fear had enveloped me, it vanished. The fog began to clear, and for a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But when I looked around, everything had changed. The path I had been following was gone. The trees were twisted, gnarled, no longer familiar. I was lost. The whisper returned, faint but unmistakable. You shouldn't have come. And that was when I understood. There was no escaping. Not from the woods. Not from the eyes. Not from the devils in Michigan. I had no idea how long I'd been running. My legs felt like lead, each step an agony, but I couldn't stop. The darkness pressed in on me, the mist closing tighter with every breath I took. I tried to think, tried to make sense of everything that had happened, but it was impossible. The world around me was shifting, bending in ways I couldn't understand, and the only thing I knew for certain was that I wasn't alone. The trees, the mist, the ground beneath my feet, they weren't just a part of the woods anymore. They felt alive, as though they were conscious, aware of my every move. And the eyes that watched me from every direction, were always there, tracking me like a predator closing in on its prey. I couldn't escape them. I stumbled again, my body too exhausted to keep moving, and finally, I collapsed. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow, ragged. For a moment, I allowed myself to rest, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. The shadows in the trees seemed to pulse, shift, and the air was thick with a presence that pressed against my skin. It wasn't just the trees. It wasn't just the fog. It was something more, something ancient and malevolent. You shouldn't have come. The whisper was louder this time, and closer. It sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was something deeper, something older. I forced myself to stand, my knees buckling as I pushed myself back up. The world tilted, everything around me spinning, but I couldn't stop. There was no time to rest. I had to keep moving. But no matter which direction I took, the path never seemed to end. The trees stretched on endlessly, the mist wrapping around me like a thick blanket. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, and that low growl, always just beneath the surface, had returned. It was growing louder, angrier, and I knew that whatever it was getting closer. I ran again, my mind racing, my thoughts fragmented. What was chasing me? What did it want? Then, through the mist, I saw it, a clearing ahead. A small patch of light. My heart leaped, hope rising in my chest. The clearing was an exit. It had to be. I pushed myself forward, stumbling through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The growl was almost deafening now, vibrating through my bones. I wasn't sure what I expected to find in the clearing, but I didn't care. Anything to escape the nightmare. But when I reached the clearing, I froze. There, in the center, was a figure. A man, or at least, it looked like one. He was tall, too tall, his limbs long and thin, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes gleamed, bloodshot and wild, and his mouth opened in a grin that made my stomach twist. You shouldn't have come. The voice, it was his voice this time, but it wasn't human. It was guttural, like the growl of a beast, the hiss of something inhuman. He took a step toward me, his movements jerky, unnatural. And then, just as quickly, the ground beneath him began to shift. The earth trembled, and I saw it, a massive, black-clawed hand emerge from the ground, reaching up to grasp him. The man, if he was even a man, didn't scream. He didn't try to escape. He simply vanished into the earth as if swallowed whole. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air had thickened again, the fog rolling in faster, the eyes glowing in the dark. I turned to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me twisted, the shadows shifting into figures, into shapes, figures that moved toward me, their eyes gleaming with that same unnatural light. The growl, now deafening, shaking the very air, was everywhere. You shouldn't have come. I had no idea if it was the trees, the land, or something else speaking anymore. It didn't matter. I had crossed the line, and now there was no escape. And then I realized something. I was never meant to leave. The figure in the clearing, the growls from the earth, the shadows that watched me, they weren't just spirits. They weren't ghosts. They were the land. The swamp. The very heart of Michigan, ancient and twisted beyond recognition. And they had claimed me. The last thing I saw was the glowing eyes closing in from all sides, the shadows swallowing the light. The whisper grew louder, a final, cruel laugh echoing in my mind. You shouldn't have come. And then there was nothing. Just darkness. The monster with the face in the window. We had been dreaming of a fresh start. After months of searching for the perfect home, we finally found it, an old farmhouse in South Dakota. It wasn't much, but it had character. The kind of character that spoke to us in a way that felt right. A place to escape the noise, to be alone together, to build something new. And so, we packed up everything and made the move. At first, everything seemed perfect. The house was quiet, the air crisp with that peculiar stillness you only get in the country. It was just the two of us, in a place that was supposed to be our sanctuary. But there was something strange about the house. It wasn't obvious at first. Just little things, like the creaks in the floorboards or the way the wind would whistle through the cracks in the windows. But there was one thing that unsettled me from the very beginning, the windows. They were everywhere. Large, old-fashioned windows that seemed to stretch across the whole house, framing every room in sight. At first, I thought it was charming. I imagined sitting by them, watching the world outside as it passed by. But as the days went on, I started noticing something odd. At night, when the house was dark and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, I could see shapes. Shadows. Moving across the windows. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the wind or the trees outside, their branches brushing against the glass. But after a while, the shadows started to feel different. They were too deliberate. Too human. And sometimes, when I looked long enough, I could swear I saw a face. A face that appeared for just a moment before disappearing into the dark. I brushed it off. It wasn't anything. Just the house settling, or some animal passing by in the night. It was nothing to be worried about. But as the days went on, it became harder to ignore. My husband, Jake, hadn't noticed anything unusual. He was too busy with work, and besides, he didn't believe in that sort of thing. But I could feel it. Something wasn't right. One night, as I sat by the window, I caught a glimpse of it again. The face. This time, it was clearer, its features sharp and unmistakable. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't the wind or the branches outside. It was real. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but the room behind me was empty. No one was there. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself that I was just tired. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I told Jake about it. He listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He thought I was just letting my imagination run wild. "It's probably just the old house," he said with a laugh. "You know, the wind, the trees. Everything creaks and moans in old buildings." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think it was just a product of my own mind playing tricks on me. But as the days passed, the shadows grew more distinct, more frequent. And the face, it was always there. Watching. Waiting. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. Something was happening. Something I couldn't explain. The house, this place we had dreamed of for so long, was beginning to feel wrong. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, the shadows crept closer. I couldn't take my eyes off the window. The face appeared again, clearer this time. It was grinning. A twisted, grotesque grin that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the air in the room grew cold. My breath became visible in front of me, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. The house groaned, the walls creaking as though they were about to collapse in on themselves. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and my heart began to race. I could hear something else now. A sound coming from outside. A low scraping noise, like nails dragging across glass. The face in the window didn't move, but the sound grew louder, more frantic. Something was coming closer. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked toward the door, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't leave. I had to see. I had to know what was out there. As I reached the window, the scraping stopped. Silence. Then, without warning, the face vanished, leaving nothing but the dark reflection of the room behind me. I didn't know what to think. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation. It was just my imagination. Maybe it was the wind, or perhaps I had seen something in the reflection of the glass. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen was real. I turned to look around the room, but there was something different now. The silence was heavier, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, as though they were alive, watching me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being hunted. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, but a part of me knew that I wasn't. Something was wrong. Something was coming. And it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. But what did it want? And why was it staring at me from the window? The next day, I tried to push the events of the night to the back of my mind. Maybe it was just a product of stress or exhaustion. After all, moving into a new home, settling into a new life, it can do things to you. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered in the corners of my thoughts, gnawing at me like the shadow of a bad dream that you can't shake off. I kept telling myself that there was nothing to fear, but every time I passed a window, I couldn't help but glance outside half expecting to see that twisted face peering back at me. That evening, Jake went out to run some errands, leaving me alone in the house. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. The sound I had hoped would stop, the scraping noise. It started as a faint, almost inaudible sound, like something dragging across the floorboards from the farthest corner of the house. I froze. My heart raced. I didn't move, not even a muscle. The scraping continued, moving closer and closer until it seemed to be right outside the room. I was too terrified to even look. The cold air returned, swirling through the living room like an invisible storm. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew that whatever was out there wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real. I felt it, deep in my bones. My instincts screamed at me to get up and run, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, my eyes darting around the room, trying to catch sight of anything that would explain the terror rising inside me. Then, as though in response to my mounting dread, the scraping stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But the silence was suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I felt like something was watching me. It was that same feeling, the one I had felt when the face had appeared in the window. The feeling of being haunted. I couldn't stay still any longer. I stood up, shakily, and walked toward the door to the back porch. I needed to get some fresh air, clear my head. As I reached the door, I saw it again. The face. It was not outside this time, but in the reflection of the window. I hadn't heard it approach. It was just there, staring back at me. Its hollow eyes gleamed in the dark, the corners of its mouth stretched into that twisted, monstrous grin. I gasped, stumbling backward. My mind was racing, but I couldn't seem to make sense of anything. I had to get out. But just as I turned to run, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Clara? I spun around, nearly knocking Jake over as he stepped into the room, his voice full of concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of the panic I could feel swelling inside me. Did you see it?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The face. In the window. It was right there. Right behind me. Jake frowned, his expression unreadable. He glanced over his shoulder toward the window. "Clara," he said softly, "there's nothing there." I opened my mouth to argue, but I couldn't find the words. I had seen it. I knew I had. And yet, standing there in the cold, empty room, with nothing but the faint reflection of myself in the window, I began to doubt everything. Maybe I had imagined it after all. Jake gently pulled me into his arms, trying to comfort me. But I couldn't shake the feeling of cold dread that clung to me. I didn't want to believe that something was wrong with the house, that something had been watching me. But the unease gnawed at me relentlessly. That night, I lay awake in bed, the shadows around me thick with unseen movement. I tried to ignore the whisper of the wind outside, the occasional creak of the floorboards. But each sound seemed to bring me closer to the edge. And then I heard it again. The scratching, like nails dragging across the walls, growing louder with each passing second. The air turned cold again, as though something was right there, just outside the door, waiting for me to look. I closed my eyes, clenching the covers tight around me, but it didn't help. It was in the room with me now, its presence unmistakable. Something was watching me, just beyond the edge of the bed. My breath hitched, my body frozen in terror. I had to open my eyes. I had to see what it was. I slowly, cautiously lifted my head from the pillow. The room was pitch dark, but I could make out the faint outline of the window across from me. I had to know if it was there, if the face was watching again. I looked. Nothing. For a moment, I almost felt relief. But then I saw it. A hand pressing up against the glass. Its fingers long and twisted, its nails like claws. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. The face wasn't in the window this time. But something was there. Something that had been waiting for me to see. And it wasn't going to let me go. The scraping started again, now louder than ever, as if it was coming from inside the walls, from behind the very structure of the house itself. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped. And whatever was out there, whatever was hiding in the shadows, wasn't going to stop until it had me. I lay there, frozen, my mind spiraling. Every inch of my body screamed at me to move, to run, but I couldn't. The fear held me in place, like invisible chains, and the sounds, those horrible, relentless sounds, only grew louder. The scraping continued, now accompanied by an unsettling thud. It was like something was pushing against the walls, as if whatever it was out there had started to claw its way in. I could feel the vibrations through the bed, tiny tremors that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I opened my mouth to call out to Jake, but no words came. My throat was dry, parched with terror. Every breath felt too loud, too urgent. The house itself seemed to breathe around me, the walls creaking and groaning as if it were alive, as though it was in on the secret I had yet to understand. I finally managed to speak, barely above a whisper, my voice trembling. Jake. But there was no answer. I turned my head slowly, panic clawing at my chest. The room was still dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. Jake's side of the bed was empty. I didn't know how long he had been gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just gone to the bathroom or stepped out for a moment. Something was wrong. The house felt wrong. I swung my legs off the bed, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. The scraping, now accompanied by something even worse, wet, sucking sounds, like the sound of something crawling through the walls, grew louder. My heart hammered in my chest as I tiptoed toward the door. I reached for the handle. But just as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a sharp, deep bang echoed from the other side of the house. It came from the basement. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The basement. I hadn't gone down there yet. We'd only just moved in, and I hadn't had the chance to explore. But now, I couldn't ignore it. Whatever was down there, whatever was making that sound, I couldn't pretend it wasn't real. The wet scraping, now joined by a low, guttural growl, seemed to come from all directions at once. I felt it reverberate in my bones, deep and primal, sending a shiver through my entire body. I had to see what it was. But fear rooted me to the spot. Then I heard a noise I will never forget. A soft, skittering sound. A low hiss, like something crawling on all fours, moving rapidly toward me. It was coming closer, closer. I turned, my breath caught in my throat, and there, in the dim light of the hallway, I saw it. The face. It wasn't in the window this time, or in the reflection, but standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the shadows. The face wasn't twisted, not like I remembered. It was worse. Its skin was stretched tight over its skull, its eyes black and empty, with no white to them, just two hollow pits. Its mouth was open, impossibly wide, as if the face itself had been stretched to fit it. Its teeth, jagged, sharp, and yellowed, glinted in the low light. I couldn't move. My body betrayed me again, refusing to respond to the instinct to flee. The face, no, the thing, stayed perfectly still, staring at me, as if it were waiting for me to make the next move. Its mouth twitched, just a little, into something like a grin. But there was nothing human about it. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I blinked, and the hallway was empty. But I knew better than to think I was just imagining things. The sound of scraping against the walls continued, but now I was joined by an almost rhythmic thudding, like something was pounding on the walls, slowly making its way toward me. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had to find Jake. He had to be somewhere, and if I could just make it to him, we could leave this place. I turned and dashed down the hallway, toward the stairs. But as I reached the top step, I froze. At the foot of the stairs, standing in the shadows, was Jake. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out. His hands were shaking, clutched tightly by his sides. "Jake?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "What's happening? What's going on?" He didn't respond. Instead, he pointed toward the basement door. I followed his gaze, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The door to the basement was wide open. A figure, tall, thin, and monstrous, was standing at the bottom of the stairs. Its form was almost human, but its face was a horrible mask of twisted features, stretched and distorted beyond recognition. Its eyes were gleaming with an unnatural glow, as though it had been waiting for us to notice it. It took a step forward, then another, slowly, deliberately, its limbs unnaturally long, creaking with every movement. Jake's face twisted in a silent scream. And then, the figure lunged. I didn't even have time to react. In one swift motion, the creature was on him, dragging him down the stairs, its hands clutching at his throat, its teeth bared like a wild animal. I tried to scream, tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the nightmare unfolding before me. The last thing I heard before everything went black was Jake's final, choking breath, cut off by the beast. The silence after that was deafening. The scraping, the pounding, everything stopped. And in the quiet, I was left alone in the dark, wondering what had become of the man I loved, and whether I would be next. I awoke to a crushing silence, the kind that fills your ears until they ache. I was on the floor, cold and disoriented, my body tangled in the thick carpet. My hands were trembling as I pushed myself to a sitting position, but the moment I looked up, everything came rushing back in a flood of terror. Jake. The image of his final moments, the gurgling scream, the way his body was yanked down into the dark abyss of the basement, replayed in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't escape. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. But my limbs were heavy, as if the very air in this house was pulling me down, dragging me into its suffocating depths. I couldn't feel my feet, and my heart raced as I stumbled to my feet. The house, it was different. The walls seemed to pulse with a low, unnatural hum, like the house itself was alive, feeding off the fear, feeding off of me. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the shadows in the corners of every room were reaching out to smother me. I took one step, then another. The floor creaked beneath me, a familiar sound, but somehow wrong now. I kept telling myself that I needed to keep moving, that I couldn't stop, couldn't hesitate. But every step felt like I was walking deeper into something that would devour me whole. I made it to the stairs, but before I could take a step down, I froze again. There, standing in the doorway at the bottom of the stairs, was the figure. The one that had taken Jake. It was there. It wasn't fully visible, not yet. The darkness seemed to cling to its form, distorting the edges of its figure, but I could see its eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes, staring up at me from the darkness below. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs wouldn't obey. My body felt heavier with each second, as if the weight of everything around me was pressing in, squeezing the air from my lungs. The figure moved, a fluid motion, like it was gliding toward me, its shape shifting with every step. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a grotesque mask of bone and sinew, no human resemblance left in it. It tilted its head slightly, as though studying me, and I felt the air grow colder with each passing moment. I didn't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, but suddenly the air shifted. I could hear something softer than a whisper, but unmistakable. Leave. The word was almost a hiss, coming from deep within the house. And then, just like that, the figure was gone, disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. I blinked, unsure if what I had seen was real, or if my mind was finally breaking under the pressure of it all. But the sounds, the scratching, the low growl, were still there. They hadn't stopped. They were getting closer. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't finished with me. I had to leave. But as I turned away from the stairs, my eyes landed on something at the corner of the room. A small, faded photograph, Jake and I, taken in the early days of our relationship, smiling in the sunlight. The edges of the photograph were curled, worn with age, but there was something wrong with it now. The photo wasn't just of us anymore. There was something else. A shadow, stretching unnaturally across the floor. It was like the photograph had been altered, edited after the fact, and there, at the far edge, was the face. The same face I had seen in the window, in the hallway, that thing. My stomach twisted with nausea, and I felt the walls close in. It wasn't just the house, it wasn't just the monster in the basement. It was everywhere. The house was alive with its presence, its evil, creeping into every inch of this place. The photos seemed to shimmer in the dim light. I reached for it, my hand shaking uncontrollably, as if I were drawn to it, compelled by something I couldn't explain. The moment my fingers brushed the surface of the photo, a cold, sharp sensation shot through my arm. I yanked my hand back, but it was too late. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows growing deeper and heavier. The walls, the floor, they were warping, twisting like something unnatural was pulling at the fabric of reality itself. And then, the voice returned. This time, it was louder. Come to me. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness in the hallway had shifted, pooling together like liquid, forming into something grotesque. The figure reappeared, but this time it was clearer, its features more defined, its body taking shape as it lurched forward. The walls groaned, and the sound of scraping echoed in the distance, drowning out everything else. The thing's eyes were the only thing I could focus on, their gleam now too bright to ignore. It wasn't just watching me, it was waiting for me. Without thinking, I bolted, running as fast as I could, the sound of my feet thudding against the wooden floor, the figure close behind. I reached the front door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock, my breath ragged. Just as I thought I had it open, the door slammed shut with an inhuman force, sending me flying backward into the hallway. A horrible laugh echoed through the house, dark, guttural, mocking. I scrambled to my feet, looking for any way out, but the hallways had changed. It was as if the house had rearranged itself, the doorways and walls no longer aligning. I was trapped. I backed into the corner, my mind spinning. There was nowhere to go. The figure was closing in, its slow, deliberate steps echoing through the air, and I couldn't stop it. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was the face, the eyes, too close, too hungry. Then, the house went silent, and I was no longer sure what was real, or if I was even still alive. I awoke again, but this time it wasn't to the muffled silence of before. This time, the air was thick with an oppressive weight, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The darkness felt deeper now, the shadows curling into corners I had never noticed before. My body ached from the fall, but worse than that was the growing sense of dread that had taken root in me. It wasn't just the house that was changing, it was me. I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy, as if gravity itself had turned against me. My mind raced. What happened? I had to escape. But where was the door? The hallway that had once been so familiar now twisted in unnatural angles. The walls seemed to close in on me, suffocating, pressing against me as though the house was aware of my every movement. I stumbled forward, my fingers grazing the edges of the walls as I tried to steady myself. Every shadow seemed to shift, like it was alive, stretching, reaching out to claim me. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, echoing from the darkness behind me. It's not over yet. I turned, but there was nothing. The hall was empty. But the feeling, the sensation that something was watching me, waiting, grew stronger with each passing second. I had to get out. I needed to leave. A voice, low and distorted, filled my mind. It's too late for that. You belong to me now. The air grew colder, and the world around me seemed to warp, the edges of reality blurring. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the voice, but it was inside me, clawing its way into my thoughts. It was everywhere, suffocating, smothering, pulling me deeper into the house. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet carried me through the maze of corridors, each turn more disorienting than the last. The house was no longer just a place. It was a prison, a living thing that had absorbed me, mind and body. The walls, the floor, the windows, they all felt like they were watching me. The footsteps followed. I could feel the presence now, just behind me, as though it was closing in. My heart pounded in my chest, and panic surged through me. The door, the exit, was just ahead. I could see it, barely, through the haze of shadows. But it was so far, too far. The darkness reached out to me, pulling me back. My breath came in short gasps, my vision blurred as I tried to push myself forward. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, the figure. The same figure I had seen in the window, in the basement, in the photo. Its eyes glowed brighter now, like twin suns, burning into my soul. I froze. There was no escaping this. It was here. It was waiting for me. The floor beneath me trembled, a low rumble that shook the entire house. The figure moved, faster now, its limbs twisting and elongating as it advanced toward me. The voice inside my head laughed, dark, cruel, triumphant. You were always mine. I couldn't move. The darkness was consuming me, wrapping around me like a blanket. The air felt thick, suffocating. My body was paralyzed with fear. And then, with a sudden clarity, I understood. There was no escape. This house had claimed me. It had always claimed me. The moment I stepped inside, I had sealed my fate. The figure wasn't some outside force. It was a part of the house, born from its walls, from the very foundation that had been built on death and suffering. It had been waiting, watching, feeding off the fear of anyone who dared enter. I had made my final mistake. The figure reached out for me, its cold, bony fingers brushing against my skin. A wave of ice washed over me as I felt its grip tighten, pulling me closer, pulling me into the very heart of the house. The walls around me seemed to bend and twist, closing in, suffocating. And then everything went black. The house stood silent once again. The next day, a group of workers arrived to assess the property, a team sent to clear the abandoned house for demolition. But when they stepped inside, they found no trace of the young couple who had lived there. No signs of struggle. No signs of anything at all. The house was empty. But as the workers explored the dusty, decaying rooms, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the broken windows, they could hear the faintest sound, a whisper, a cry, carried on the air, echoing through the empty halls. No one could explain it. But the house, it was still waiting. Dead don't fear. I should have known. No one ever warned me about the tunnels. They're just part of the city, right? A crumbling relic, forgotten by most, but essential to those who work down there. Most people think of the subway, or maybe the maintenance tunnels when they hear about the underground world beneath New York. But there are others. Deeper, darker passages that stretch further than you could imagine. And that's where I found myself that night. The job was simple, checking the wiring, making sure everything was intact. A routine job, something I had done 100 times. It was my third week on the night shift, and I was starting to get used to the hum of the city above, the occasional flicker of a light from a far-off corner, and the low, unsettling silence of the tunnels. But that night, something felt off. It started as a whisper, a rustling sound I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just the pipes, or the wind, or maybe even the vibrations of a passing train. But then it came again. Closer this time. A sound too deliberate to be a coincidence, too alive. I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight darting around, casting long shadows on the walls. The tunnel stretched before me like an endless, dark throat, swallowing the light. I could hear it now, scratching, scuttling. A sound that shouldn't belong in a place like this. Pigeons, rats, those are the usual inhabitants down here. But this wasn't like that. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could almost feel something moving, just beyond the reach of the beam of my flashlight. My grip tightened around the flashlight as I slowly started walking again, my shoes clicking against the damp concrete floor. Each step I took seemed to echo louder, as if the tunnel was somehow amplifying the sound, making it more unbearable. I told myself it was nothing. A rat, maybe. Just a big one. Or some old pipes shifting in the walls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. And the sound was getting louder. Closer. Then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a fleeting movement, just a blur in the corner of my eye. But then it stopped. I froze. The tunnel ahead seemed to bend, warping at the edges. My heart began to race. A set of glowing eyes, bright, unnaturally so, stared back at me from the darkness. It couldn't be. It didn't make sense. But there they were, two pairs of eyes, reflecting my flashlight like twin lanterns in the dark. I had to move. I turned, my feet slipping slightly on the wet floor, the sound of the rustling growing louder now, as if it was chasing me. I ran. As I sprinted down the corridor, the scuttling noise behind me grew louder. There was something more to it. Something big. A shiver ran down my spine as I thought I could hear multiple sets of claws scraping against the floor. It was impossible. There was no way that many rats could fit down here. No way something could grow that big in the shadows. Then the shadows moved again. I stopped, breath catching in my throat. The flashlight beam flickered and I cursed under my breath. The darkness seemed to shift around me, closing in as the distant glow from the eyes drew nearer. There was something wrong, so wrong, about the way they moved. They didn't dart like rats, quick and unpredictable. These movements were methodical, controlled. A pause, then another step closer. Another set of eyes joining the first. Where are they? My mind scrambled for an explanation, but there was nothing. I turned again, my pulse pounding in my ears, but the sound of their movement followed me, closer now. I ran again, harder, faster. The tunnel stretched before me like an endless abyss. My flashlight cut through the dark, but every turn seemed to lead to another, darker passage. I couldn't escape. The sound of those things getting closer, each step a beat of terror in my chest. And then, click. I stumbled. The flashlight fell from my hands, bouncing across the floor, its beam skittering across the walls like a wild, frantic thing. The sound stopped. It was silent now, too silent. I could hear my breathing, ragged and heavy, echoing in the narrow tunnel. I crouched down, my heart racing, trying to calm my thoughts. But I wasn't alone. The eyes. There were more now. 6. No, 7. 8. They were all around me, lining the walls, gleaming with that sickly glow. The shadows seemed to stretch out toward me, reaching. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking. When I touched it, I heard the click of claws on the concrete. They were close. Too close. God, where are they? I had no choice now. I had to get out. I had to get back to the surface. The fear that gripped me was like nothing I had ever felt before. I ran. But this time, I didn't stop. I could hear them now, moving fast behind me. The shadows were no longer just shadows. There were shapes, long, twisted bodies, writhing like something out of a nightmare, hunched and grotesque. The eyes blinked, shifting in the dark, and a low growl rumbled through the air. I turned a corner, my feet slipping again, but this time the light ahead, the exit, was visible. I had to make it. I had to get out. I was almost there. The ground trembled beneath me, and the walls seemed to shudder. My lungs burned, but I pushed on, knowing if I stopped, it would be the last time. And then, I saw them. The rats, or whatever they were, poured out from the shadows. Their eyes glowed like beacons, and they moved faster now, closing in. Their teeth gleamed sharp in the darkness. There was no way to avoid them. No way to escape. And then the light blinked out. I don't remember much about what happened after the lights went out. It was like my brain shut down, refusing to process the fear. My hands trembled as I stumbled forward, still trying to push through the thick, heavy air of the tunnel. There was no sound now, just a hollow silence that pressed in on me from every direction, like the darkness itself was alive and breathing. I had to get out. That was the only thing that mattered. But the tunnel, it seemed endless. The walls closed in, the air growing thicker with every step. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my feet slapping against the concrete as I stumbled forward, disoriented. Then, just as I thought I was about to break through the darkness, I heard it. A low growl. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, it came again, louder this time, closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized it wasn't just one. There were more. And they were all around me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering weakly, casting an eerie glow across the tunnel. There was nothing there. Just shadows. But the growl persisted. It was coming from behind me, from the depths of the darkness. I had no idea what it was, but I knew it wasn't natural. It wasn't any animal I had ever heard before. Panic surged through me, making it hard to think, to breathe. I had to keep moving. I couldn't let them get any closer. The footsteps came next. Heavy, dragging steps, slow but steady, like something, or someone, was stalking me, drawing closer with every passing second. My mind raced. It's just your imagination, I told myself. Just the darkness playing tricks on you. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The light from my flashlight barely pierced the dark. My hand shook as I tried to hold it steady, the beam wavering back and forth. That's when I saw them. Two glowing eyes, bright and unblinking, appeared at the far end of the tunnel. They were small at first, barely visible, but they grew bigger as they moved toward me. And then I saw them. Huge rats, no, not rats, creatures, taller than any I had ever seen, with twisted, unnatural limbs that seemed to bend in ways they shouldn't. Their bodies were grotesque, covered in patches of dark, matted fur, their sharp claws scraping against the concrete floor. Their eyes burned bright yellow in the dark, reflecting the light like the embers of a dying fire. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. They were all around me now, crawling from the shadows, their eyes gleaming, their mouths opening wide to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I backed up, my body shaking with terror, my pulse pounding in my ears. But it was too late. The tunnel was too narrow. There was no escape. I tried to raise the flashlight, to shine it at them, but the beam only seemed to anger them. One of the creatures lunged at me, its jaws snapping, and I barely managed to dodge, stumbling backward. My legs gave way beneath me, and I hit the cold floor with a thud. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, rolling out of reach as the creature loomed over me. Its breath came in hot, foul bursts, and I could hear the sound of its claws scratching against the concrete as it prepared to strike. I was done for. But then, I heard something else. A screech. A terrible, high-pitched noise that cut through the air like a knife. The creatures froze, their heads turning toward the sound. And then they retreated. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in fear, but the creatures were gone. For now. I slowly pushed myself to my feet, my body aching from the fall. The tunnel was eerily quiet again, but the silence was suffocating. What had just happened? What were those things? And why had they stopped? I didn't know. I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of there. I picked up the flashlight, my hands still trembling, and tried to get my bearings. The exit was closer now, or at least it seemed that way. I didn't trust my senses anymore, not after what I had just seen. But I had no choice. I had to keep going. Every step I took felt heavier than the last. The weight of the fear pressing down on me, the knowledge that those things were still out there, watching, following. As I neared the exit, I could feel it. The presence. It was back. I wasn't alone anymore. There were more eyes now. More shapes lurking just out of sight, blending with the darkness. They were circling, waiting. The sound of their claws scraping against the floor was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And it was getting louder. I was too close to give up now. I had to make it. I pushed through the last stretch of tunnel, my chest tight with fear. But when I reached the end, there was no light. The door I had been heading for was gone. It wasn't there anymore. I turned around. The creatures were closer now, their glowing eyes reflecting the dim light from my flashlight. I could hear them moving, hear the scrape of their claws, the click of their teeth. They were coming for me. I didn't have much time left. I had to run. But where to? The air around me felt suffocating. I stumbled backward, panic overtaking every rational thought in my head. My mind screamed, "Run," but my legs felt as though they were made of stone, refusing to obey. The creatures, those grotesque, monstrous rats, were closing in, their glowing eyes fixed on me, predatory and hungry. Why wasn't I running? The question hit me like a slap, and yet my body betrayed me. Every muscle in my legs screamed for me to move, but fear held me in place, like an invisible force. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a dark shape move. It wasn't one of the creatures, it was another figure, human. Someone was here. Someone else who had come for the same reason I had. To work. To survive. But there was no time to find out. The creatures were already moving toward me, slow at first, but with a terrifying, relentless pace. I had to get out. I had to get out now. I forced my legs to move, taking a step backward, then another. The light from my flashlight wavered, casting long, eerie shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. The sounds of scratching claws and low growls were growing louder, and I could feel them getting closer. I couldn't risk looking behind me. I just had to move. I had to get to the exit. It was the only way. The tunnel stretched on, endless. The walls seemed to close in, the dim light flickering weakly as I made my way through. My breath came in ragged gasps, sweat stinging my eyes. I could hear them behind me now, shuffling, scraping, like a swarm of creatures too many to count. The sounds became so overwhelming, it was hard to tell where they were coming from. Was it only one? Were they all behind me? I turned a corner quickly, almost slipping on the uneven ground, and there it was, an opening. A hatch. The way out. I didn't think. I just ran. But when I reached it, my heart sank. The hatch was locked. No, no, no. I slammed my hands against it, frantic, my breath short, eyes wild. But the door didn't budge. My mind raced as I looked around for another way. There had to be another exit. There had to be something. And then I saw it. At the far end of the tunnel, the faintest glimmer of light. A gap, a crack in the concrete. I ran toward it without thinking, ignoring the sharp sting in my legs, my head pounding as I pushed myself forward. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, like it was mocking me, but I couldn't stop. The creatures were still behind me. I could feel them drawing closer. Their eyes were like burning coals, reflecting the dim light of my flashlight. I could hear their claws clicking on the ground, louder with every passing second. I couldn't outrun them, not like this. But if I could get to that gap, maybe, just maybe, I'd be able to escape. I reached the crack, my hands shaking as I tried to squeeze through. The space was tight, and I was too big, too slow. My body felt heavy, like lead, as I pushed and shoved, desperate. I heard the sound of claws scraping against the concrete behind me. I didn't have much time. And then, I was through. I stumbled out into the open, gasping for air, my body slick with sweat. The cool air hit me, and for a moment, I thought I might be free. I thought I might actually make it. But then I heard the growl again. It was closer this time, much closer. I looked around. I was outside, I was free. But there were no other workers. No one else in sight. I was alone. I tried to take a step, but my legs felt like they were about to give way beneath me. I had to get away. I had to get out of this place. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath me. A low rumble, as though the earth itself was reacting to something far below. It felt like the entire tunnel system, the underground city, was alive. And then I saw it. A massive, twisting form rose from the shadows. The creatures, the rats, no, not rats anymore, were not just in the tunnels. They were spreading. They were bigger now. A lot bigger. Larger than anything I had ever seen, their forms towering over me, their eyes glowing bright in the dark. They were everywhere. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just ran. But the ground was shaking too violently now. It was like the world was falling apart. The creatures were closing in, and I could hear their terrible growls, their snapping jaws, as they surrounded me. One of them lunged at me. I barely managed to dodge, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. My chest heaved with the effort, but I could already feel the weight of the darkness pressing on me again. The fear. The certainty that this was it. That I wasn't going to make it. I managed to scramble to my feet and looked around. The light from the flashlight was almost gone, the beam flickering weakly, casting ghostly shadows that danced like specters. And then, I saw him. A man, tall, disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty. He was standing in the shadows, watching me. His eyes were wide, frantic. He looked just as lost and terrified as I felt. But he wasn't helping. He wasn't coming to my aid. He just stood there, motionless. I didn't have time to ask why. I turned and ran. But there was no escape. Not from the rats. Not from whatever was happening down there. I was already too far gone. I could feel my legs giving out beneath me as I sprinted down the narrow streets, desperate for any escape. The air felt too thick, as if the city itself was suffocating under the weight of whatever had been unleashed in the tunnels. The ground was still shaking, an unnerving, constant tremor that threatened to swallow me whole. I didn't know how long I could keep running. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. For now, I was alone. Had I lost them? It was hard to say. The shadows had a way of playing tricks on the mind, bending and warping into shapes that didn't make sense. Every time I thought I heard a sound, I'd turn and find nothing, only the empty street stretching before me, desolate and silent. I stumbled over a crack in the pavement, almost falling face first into the concrete, but caught myself at the last second. My breath was shallow now, more ragged with each step. The fear gnawed at me, pulling at my insides like a cold hand squeezing my chest. I felt like I was running from something more than just the creatures. It was the weight of the unknown, the dread of knowing something was coming, something worse than I could possibly imagine. I had to get to the surface. I had to make it to the light. I turned down an alley, hoping to find a way to climb out, but the darkness seemed to close in around me, thickening like fog. The walls seemed to move, stretch, and sway. I had been in these streets countless times before, but now they were unrecognizable, warped and twisted by the fear that gripped my mind. The growl came again. This time, it was closer. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat like a hammer in my ears. I broke into a sprint again, not daring to look back, even though every fiber of my being screamed to turn and face it. The shadows behind me seemed to shift, growing larger with every step I took. It wasn't just rats. No, something far worse was lurking, something older, more ancient, and it was hunting me. I reached the end of the alley, gasping for air, my legs aching. I knew I was near one of the main exits. There were always maintenance tunnels leading up to the surface, usually locked, but if I could find one of the access points, I might stand a chance. As I rounded the corner, I saw it. The hatch. The exit. I ran toward it, desperate, but when I reached for the handle, my heart stopped. It was gone. The hatch, the only way out, had vanished. There was nothing but smooth, solid concrete where it had once been. The world tilted under my feet, and I felt as though the ground beneath me had opened up, pulling me deeper into the earth. It wasn't real. It had to be some kind of sick joke. I backed away, my breath quick and shallow, my mind spiraling out of control. My fingers trembled as they brushed against the smooth surface of the wall, feeling for some hidden latch, some crack, anything that might lead to safety. But there was nothing. No. No, no, no. I turned, my heart racing, and there it was again, the sound of scraping claws against the concrete. The creatures were closing in, the growls now deafening, shaking the air around me. I could feel their presence, their eyes boring into me from the shadows. I had no choice. I ran. I didn't know where I was going anymore. There was no plan, no hope. I just had to keep moving, keep running. The world around me was crumbling, turning into something unrecognizable, and I couldn't afford to stop. Not now. I heard a loud crash, followed by a screeching sound, like metal being twisted and torn apart. I didn't dare look back. The noise was so close. So damn close. The creatures were coming, and they were coming fast. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath my feet. I dropped like a stone, my body falling into darkness. I landed hard, the impact jarring my spine, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to stop. I scrambled to my feet, pain shooting up my leg as I tried to regain my balance. The tunnel ahead was narrow and winding, an old maintenance shaft I had only seen in passing. The walls were lined with rusted pipes, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. I didn't know if this would be another dead end, but I had no choice but to go forward. I could still hear them, closer now, their growls vibrating in the walls around me, their heavy breathing growing louder. I could almost feel their hot breath on the back of my neck, could hear their claws skittering along the metal, echoing in the tight space. The panic began to set in again. My vision blurred as my mind raced, trying to piece together a way out, a way to survive this nightmare. My thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, of confusion, and a growing sense of hopelessness. What if there was no escape? What if the world outside had already been consumed by whatever was down here? The creatures, the rats, whatever they weren't just in the tunnels anymore. They were everywhere. I kept moving, stumbling through the claustrophobic shaft. My hands brushed against the cold metal pipes, my breath ragged and shallow. The further I went, the more the walls seemed to close in, the air thicker and more suffocating. And then, there was a sound, a scraping noise, like claws on concrete. But it wasn't behind me. It was ahead. I froze. No. The sound grew louder, closer. The air grew colder. I could feel it, the presence of something. Something waiting for me. Watching me. I turned slowly, heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it. Two glowing eyes, watching me from the end of the shaft. I didn't have to see the rest. I knew what it was. It was waiting. The darkness in front of me seemed to pulse, the glowing eyes shimmering like lanterns in a pitch-black sea. The thing watching me wasn't just a rat, it wasn't even just one of them. It was something more, something ancient and hungry, its gaze fixated on me as though I were its prey. Its body blended into the shadows, but I could make out enough, too much, of its form. Something huge, something that shouldn't have existed, lurked in the darkness. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't move fast enough. I could feel the ground vibrating beneath me, the walls trembling with each movement from the creature, its claws scraping the metal as it drew closer. I can't outrun this. The thought struck me with horrifying clarity. There was no escape. No exit. The walls were closing in, the tunnel narrowing, and the thing, whatever it was still coming, its eyes growing larger as it neared. My mind raced. I had nothing left. My body was on the verge of collapse, my muscles screaming in protest from the strain. The only sound was the heavy thumping of my heart and the soft, almost rhythmic scratching of the creature's claws, getting louder with every passing second. I needed to think. I had to do something. I scanned the shaft, searching desperately for anything I could use, a weapon, a tool, anything. The rusted pipes, the jagged edges of broken metal. There, a piece of scrap metal, sharp and jagged, half buried in the dirt. It was all I had. My fingers fumbled for it, trembling as I pulled it free. I could feel the presence of the creature growing, its breath hot on my skin. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, as though the tunnel itself was reaching out to claim me. I gripped the metal tightly, the makeshift weapon now my only hope. It's just a rat. It's just a rat. That's what I told myself, trying to calm my spiraling thoughts. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Whatever had been unleashed in these tunnels was no ordinary animal. It was a monster, a nightmare made flesh. And it wanted me. I didn't have time to think about the impossible odds stacked against me. I had to survive. I had to keep fighting. The creature's growl echoed down the tunnel, low and guttural, sending a shiver down my spine. The eyes came closer, glowing bright in the darkness, filling my vision, swallowing everything else. I swung the metal scrap in front of me, the sharp edge catching the faint light. The creature stopped, its growl turning into a hissing sound, like steam escaping from a pressure valve. It was close now, so close that I could hear its breath, wet and foul, as it exhaled in slow, deliberate bursts. Then, without warning, it lunged. I didn't think, I just reacted. I thrust the metal shard forward, the sharp edge slicing through the air. For a moment, I felt a sharp jolt of triumph until the weight of the creature's body crashed into me. The impact sent me flying backward, slamming into the hard metal walls of the tunnel. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe, the air knocked out of my lungs. My head spun, and I felt the taste of blood in my mouth. This is it. It's over. I was disoriented, my body aching, but the instinct to survive kicked in. I reached up with shaking hands, grabbing the piece of metal again, the only thing between me and the nightmare that was now on top of me. The creature snarled, its hot breath mixing with the cold, stale air. Its claws scraped across the ground, inches from my face. I swung the metal shard wildly, striking it in the side, pushing with every ounce of strength I had left. It screeched, a sound that tore through the tunnel, but it didn't relent. It came at me again, its massive jaws snapping just inches from my throat. I can't die here. I thought of the surface, of daylight, of the world above, but the tunnel seemed to mock me, stretching out endlessly. There was no escape. And then, out of nowhere, a blinding light filled the tunnel. It wasn't the sun, no, that would have been too much to hope for. It was headlights. Headlights of a truck, shining bright in the darkness, cutting through the oppressive gloom of the tunnel. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. But the sound of the engine, the rumble of a vehicle that didn't belong here, was real. The creature froze, its eyes wide with panic, its body jerking back as if it had seen something even more dangerous than me. The truck screeched to a halt in the middle of the tunnel. The door opened, and a figure stepped out, one of the workers from the maintenance crew. He was holding a large rifle, his face pale, eyes wide with shock. But there was no time for questions, no time for anything other than survival. The creature lunged at him, faster than I thought possible. I screamed, but the worker was ready. He fired. The shot echoed, loud and deafening, bouncing off the tunnel walls. The creature let out a deafening screech, its body convulsing as the bullet struck it. It stumbled backward, momentarily stunned, and that was all the time I needed. I scrambled to my feet, pain shooting through my body, and I ran. I didn't look back. The worker fired again, and the creature fell, its body collapsing to the ground in a heap of twitching limbs. The light from the truck illuminated the wreckage, and I saw it, its massive form, twisted and mangled, still twitching in its final moments. I reached the truck, breathless, covered in sweat and dirt. The worker looked at me with wide eyes, but didn't say anything. I didn't have time to explain. I just climbed into the truck, slamming the door behind me. The truck revved, pulling away from the scene, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I breathed. But even as the truck moved further from the creature, as the light from the headlights cut through the darkness, I knew something was wrong. The surface, the world above, it didn't feel like a safe place anymore. I had survived, yes. But the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. And whatever had come out of those tunnels was only the first of many horrors. The world wasn't ready for what was about to happen. Cult of worship. I remember the first time I saw the town. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, nestled in the valley like an untouched secret. The trees whispered in the wind, and the streets were lined with quaint houses, each one like a picture from an old postcard. But something about it didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way the air felt too still, or the way the people watched us when we arrived, like they knew something we didn't. I had moved to this small town with my daughter, Emma, hoping for a fresh start. After everything that had happened back in the city, I thought this quiet life would be exactly what we needed. A new beginning. But from the moment we set foot here, I felt a strange tension in the air. It was subtle at first, a lingering unease that clung to everything, like dust you couldn't wipe away. Emma was only 10, too young to understand the weight of what I felt, but even she sensed it. She would sometimes stare at the woods behind our house, her eyes wide with curiosity, as if something was calling her. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of it all. It was a Thursday afternoon when I first heard the whispers. I was unpacking the last of the boxes when I noticed a figure standing at the edge of our yard, watching us. I froze, unsure of whether I'd imagined it. The figure was a man, tall and thin, with a face that seemed to have been carved from stone. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something you might see in a historical movie, but it was the way he stood that unsettled me. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and his eyes, those eyes, stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. But I couldn't. Maybe it was just someone passing by, or maybe it was one of the locals. The town was small, after all, and people often knew everyone else's business. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I couldn't help but feel that something was very wrong. And as the days passed, I would learn that my instincts were right. That evening, as Emma and I sat at the kitchen table, she asked me about the man. "Mom," she said, her voice hesitant. "Who was that man in the yard?" "He was watching us." I paused, looking at her face. It was pale, her wide eyes reflecting the same unease I'd felt. I tried to smile, but the effort felt hollow. "I don't know, sweetheart. Probably just someone from town. We'll get used to it." But Emma wasn't convinced. "Mom, he looked different. His clothes were strange, and his eyes," she shivered, clutching her doll tightly. "They were scary." I didn't know how to respond. "He probably just looked like that because he's from around here," I said. "People in small towns dress funny sometimes." But Emma wasn't reassured. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, her eyes darting back to the woods. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The air felt thick, suffocating, and every creak of the house seemed amplified in the silence. I tossed and turned, the events of the day replaying in my mind. Something about the town felt wrong. It wasn't just the man, it was the way everyone seemed to avoid eye contact, the way they never talked about the woods. They all seemed to know something that I didn't, something they weren't telling us. At around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate, too controlled. I got up and peeked through the blinds. My heart skipped a beat. The man was there again. He stood at the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line, watching our house. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like two small embers in the night. I couldn't look away, transfixed by the way he stood so still, so unnatural. I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't notice me. But then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned, his eyes locking onto mine. A chill ran down my spine as he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, predatory. And then, without another word, he disappeared into the trees. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew this was real. Something was happening here, and I had no idea how to stop it. Days passed, but the unsettling feeling in the air didn't subside. If anything, it grew stronger. The townspeople, though kind, always seemed to be hiding something. Conversations would stop when we walked into a room, and when we went to the market, the shopkeeper's eyes would linger on us just a little too long, like she was memorizing our every move. Emma's behavior grew stranger too. She began talking to herself, whispering to the dolls she carried around everywhere. At first, I thought it was just her imagination, but the more she spoke, the more her words felt different. Like she was repeating something she'd heard before. Something old. It wasn't until the following Sunday that I began to put the pieces together. We decided to attend the local church, one of the few buildings in town that was still standing tall and well maintained. It was an old, stone building, its walls marked by years of weather and time. But as we entered, I immediately felt the change in the atmosphere. It wasn't the familiar smell of wood and incense you'd expect from a church. Instead, it was musty, like the air had been locked inside for decades. And the people, they were different too. Their eyes were vacant, distant, as if they were there but not really present. The priest, an older man with sharp features and a cold smile, greeted us. "Welcome to our sanctuary," he said, his voice soft, almost too soft. "It's rare that we have new visitors. You must be the ones who just moved into the woods." I nodded, but the mention of the woods made me uneasy. "Yes, we're settling in. It's a lovely town." He smiled again, but this time it seemed more knowing. "It is. And the woods hold great secrets. You'll see soon enough." The phrase sent a chill through me, but I kept my thoughts to myself. I was still trying to adjust to everything here, still unsure if it was all in my head. The service began, and the congregation fell into a strange, synchronized rhythm. They sang hymns in low, haunting voices that reverberated through the air like a chant. I glanced at Emma beside me, but her face was blank. She wasn't looking at me, she was staring ahead, her eyes fixed on the altar. Her lips moved silently, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was repeating the same words as the others. After the service, the priest invited us to stay for tea and talk. I hesitated but agreed, hoping to understand more about the town and its people. We sat in a small room behind the church, and the conversation started normally enough. The priest asked about our old home, and I spoke about our life in the city. But there was something unsettling in his gaze. He asked more questions than seemed necessary, probing into our past in a way that felt too personal. I could feel the tension building, the same feeling that had been growing inside me since we arrived. As the conversation continued, I noticed the others in the room, churchgoers, I assumed, standing in the shadows, watching us with that same unsettling intensity. Then Emma spoke up. Her voice was soft at first, but it carried the weight of something far deeper than a child's whimsy. "The man in the woods says you're not safe here," she whispered, her eyes focused on the priest. A hushed silence fell over the room. I froze, unsure how to respond, but the priest only smiled. "Ah," he said, his voice steady, "the woods speak to her. They often speak to those who are pure of heart." I felt my stomach twist. There was something wrong here, something ancient in their words. Emma was only a child. How could she possibly know about the man in the woods? "Emma," I said softly, trying to draw her attention away from the priest. Don't talk like that. It's just a dream. But Emma didn't listen. She turned to me slowly, her expression distant. Mom, the man in the woods says it's too late. He says they're coming. I could see the confusion and fear in her eyes, and yet she wasn't afraid. It was as though she was speaking of something she understood deeply, something I couldn't comprehend. The priest's smile never faltered. Don't worry, my dear, he said to me, the woods are very old. They have seen many things. But they are also very protective. They guard the truth that lies beneath the surface. I looked at the other members of the congregation, their faces blank, their eyes unblinking. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for us to understand. I felt a sickening realization crawl up my spine. This wasn't just a town. It wasn't just a quiet place to settle down. There was something dark lurking beneath it all, something older and far more dangerous than I could have imagined. As we left the church that afternoon, Emma kept looking over her shoulder, as though she could see something I couldn't. Something that had been there all along, hiding just out of sight. The rustling of the trees seemed louder now, almost like voices carried on the wind. And the woods were calling to her. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into something much darker than I had ever feared. And it was too late to leave. That night, the sound of the wind in the trees outside our cabin was different. It was heavier, more insistent, like it was carrying something I couldn't quite place. I tried to ignore it, but the tension in the air felt like a pressure against my chest, making it harder to breathe. Emma had fallen asleep early, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch farther than they should, as if they were alive, moving. I tried to tell myself it was the trees casting their shapes through the windows, but deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong. I stood by the window, staring out into the blackness of the woods, trying to make sense of what had been happening. The town was quiet, too quiet, and the faint rustle of leaves outside seemed to grow louder, more distinct. Then, a noise cut through the silence, a soft scraping sound, like nails against stone. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The sound came again, closer this time. I stepped back from the window, my breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the woods. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, some small creature moving through the underbrush, but it didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. Suddenly, I heard a soft knock at the door. It was so quiet, so delicate, that I almost didn't hear it at first. But when I did, my pulse quickened. I stood there, motionless, listening for another sound. The door was locked, the house was secured. I was alone. The knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. Mom? Emma's voice broke through the tension, her small figure appearing in the doorway of my room. I heard them. They're here. I turned to look at her, my stomach dropping. She stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with an intensity one had never seen before. She was staring out the window, her expression blank, as if she was seeing something beyond the dark forest. Who's here, Emma? I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm, but my mind was racing. I didn't want to scare her. What are you talking about? The ones who are waiting, she said, her voice soft but firm. They've been calling me. They want me to come outside. I rushed to her, kneeling down to her level. You're safe here, Emma. Don't listen to whatever it is you think you're hearing. It's just the wind. But Emma shook her head, her lips trembling. No, it's not. They're calling me. I can feel them. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all connected. The town, the church, the woods, it was all tied together. I had to find out what it all meant before it was too late. The night stretched on in silence after that, the only sound the faint wind outside. I stayed awake, listening to the soft creaks and groans of the house settling, trying to make sense of everything. But the feeling of being watched never left me. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a momentary sense of relief. It was a new day. Maybe things would be better. But as I looked out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the forest, I saw figures standing in a line. They were too far away to make out clearly, but their shape was unmistakable. Tall, dark, and unmoving, like statues. I squinted, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but when I blinked, they were still there. I gasped, pulling away from the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked back at Emma, who had also seen them. She was standing by the door, staring at the figures with a strange calmness, her eyes fixed and unblinking. "Mom, they're waiting for me," she whispered, her voice distant, as if she were speaking to someone else. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to get us out of here. This town, these people, whatever was happening, it was too dangerous. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. It was never just about leaving. It was about breaking something that had already taken hold. I turned to Emma, my thoughts racing. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firm. "Now. We'll pack, and we'll go." But Emma didn't move. She stood still, her gaze fixed on the figures in the woods, as if she couldn't hear me, as if she was no longer fully present. "Emma," I called out, my voice rising in panic, but she didn't respond. I walked toward her, grabbing her hand, trying to pull her away from the door, but she resisted. Her grip tightened, and she looked up at me with wide eyes, filled with something I couldn't name. "They want me," she said, almost pleading. "I have to go." Before I could respond, I heard the scrape of claws on stone again, louder this time. Closer. It was unmistakable. The creatures were in the woods, and they were coming closer, closing in. I pulled Emma into my arms, but she fought me. "No," she screamed. "Let me go." The door slammed open behind me, and I turned in shock. The air was cold now, and a heavy fog was creeping into the room, carrying with it a feeling of suffocating dread. There was no time left. They were here. I could feel it. The air had thickened, weighed down by something dark and ancient. The fog that had crept into the room swirled around our feet, as though it were alive, searching, pulling us into the unknown. Emma, still in my arms, was no longer fighting me. She had gone completely still, her body unnaturally tense, her eyes glazed over as if she were in a trance. The sound of scraping claws grew louder, more frantic, and the shadows outside the window were moving. I could see them now, not just standing in the woods, but moving toward us, their forms growing more distinct. Tall, twisted shapes, their limbs unnaturally long, their heads low to the ground, like some grotesque fusion of animal and shadow. They were closing in, surrounding the house. I had no time to think, no time to question how or why, only to survive. "Mom," Emma whispered, her voice hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "They're here." I felt the familiar surge of panic rush through my veins, but I had no choice now but to act. I didn't know what they were or what they wanted, but I knew I couldn't let them take Emma. I had to keep her safe, no matter the cost. "Listen to me, Emma," I said, shaking her, trying to get through to her. "We're leaving. We're going now. Do you hear me?" Her eyes flickered, but there was no recognition in them. She wasn't Emma anymore. Not the girl I knew. Then, the scraping sound came again, closer, too close. It was no longer a sound from the woods, but from the very walls of the house. Nails against wood, claws scraping the floor, like something was trying to break in, trying to get through. The door to the room was shaking now, and I could hear low, guttural growls from the other side. I moved quickly, grabbing the nearest item I could find, a chair, and shoved it against the door, hoping it would buy me some time. Emma didn't react, didn't speak, just continued to stare vacantly ahead. "Please, Emma," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Please, we have to go. We can't stay here." But she didn't respond. She was slipping away from me. Slowly, methodically, her hand lifted, pointing toward the door. Her lips moved, and though I couldn't make out the words, I could feel the weight of her gaze. She wasn't seeing me anymore. She was seeing something else, something in the darkness. Suddenly, there was a violent crash, followed by a scream, a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a human scream. It was animalistic, primal, and filled with an agony that chilled me to the core. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the fog and the shadows, I saw a figure, a man, maybe, but it was hard to tell. His body was twisted, contorted in ways that didn't seem possible. He was moving toward us, his limbs stretching unnaturally, dragging along the floor, his face a grotesque, elongated mask of hunger and madness. I grabbed Emma and pulled her back, away from the door, away from the horrors that were closing in. But she didn't resist. She didn't even move. It was as if she were already a part of them, a part of something much larger and older than I could ever understand. A voice broke through the silence then, soft but chilling, like a whisper in my ear. "It's too late. You can't leave now. She belongs to us." The words sent a wave of cold terror through me. I turned to find the source of the voice, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, the fog, and the creeping shapes outside the house. I knew then that we were trapped. There was no escaping whatever had already claimed Emma. Whatever was pulling her into the darkness. The walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in on me, the air growing thick with something malevolent. I could feel the presence of the creatures outside, their eyes watching us from every angle, their breath like a low, rumbling growl. They were waiting for something. Waiting for her. Suddenly, Emma's voice broke the silence again, but this time it wasn't her voice. It was deep, guttural, twisted, like it was coming from somewhere far beneath the earth. "They are here," it said. "They are coming for you, for us all." I felt my stomach drop. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. The weight of the darkness outside was pressing in, and I felt the walls closing tighter around me. The fog had spread further now, seeping through cracks, covering everything in a heavy, suffocating veil. Through the haze, I saw the figures moving toward the house, their long limbs scraping against the walls as they crawled. Their eyes were glowing, faint at first, then brighter, burning with an otherworldly fire. I knew we were out of time. Whatever was going to happen, it was happening now. With shaking hands, I turned to the door. The creatures were almost upon us. I had to make a choice. "Emma," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We have to go. We can't stay here." But Emma didn't look at me. Her gaze was still fixed on the door, her eyes vacant, lost. She had already made her choice. And then, as the creatures breached the door, the last thing I saw before everything went black was her smile. It wasn't her smile. It was a smile that wasn't human, twisted and filled with hunger. I tried to scream, but the darkness consumed me before I could. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time had no meaning as I floated in the void, suspended between the crushing weight of the darkness and the desperate longing to escape. The silence was deafening, an unnatural stillness that clawed at my mind, pulling me deeper into the abyss. But then, a sound, soft, faint, like the flutter of wings with a distant echo of whispers. My eyes snapped open. I was no longer in the cabin. The fog was gone, and the air was thin, cold, metallic. The ground beneath me was uneven, the walls jagged and dark, as though I had been dragged into a place where light no longer existed. I could barely see, but the stench in the air, the scent of decay, rot, and something worse, was enough to make my stomach churn. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. My limbs felt like lead, heavy, bound by invisible chains. Panic gripped me, and I fought against the restraints, my chest tightening with every failed attempt to break free. I could hear them, the creatures, skittering in the distance, their claws tapping against stone, dragging across the ground, getting closer. "Emma!" I croaked, my throat raw, but the sound barely reached my ears. My voice was weak, fragile. I wasn't sure where she was. I didn't know if she was even still alive. But I had to find her. I had to get her back. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and shift, undulating like living things. They whispered, but I couldn't understand their words, just the low hum of something old, something ancient, lurking at the edges of my mind. The figures I had seen before, the tall, twisted shapes, were now more distinct, standing just beyond the periphery of my vision. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, the glow burning like embers in a dying fire. They were waiting, watching. I managed to turn my head, my eyes scanning the suffocating blackness. There, in the distance, was a faint flicker of light. A dim glow, barely visible, as if it were coming from some unreachable source. The light seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, like a heartbeat, and something deep inside me told me I had to reach it. I began to crawl, dragging my body forward with whatever strength I had left. Every movement was agony, each inch felt like miles, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't give in. I had to find Emma. As I moved closer to the light, the air around me seemed to shift. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were no longer just distant echoes, but voices, calling my name, whispering secrets, promises, threats. "Come to us," one voice hissed, its tone sickly sweet, like a siren's call. "Join us, and you will be free." Another voice, deeper, raspier, followed. "She's one of us now. She cannot escape." I shook my head, trying to block out their words, but the terror in their voices twisted my mind, pulling me deeper into the web of confusion. The shadows were everywhere now, closing in, suffocating the space around me. But then, something else. A sound. A cry. Emma's cry. It echoed through the darkness, a sharp, piercing wail that made my heart race. It was her, I was sure of it. Without thinking, I pushed myself harder, faster, towards the light, towards her. The whispers turned into screams, their voices becoming frantic, desperate. The light ahead grew brighter, its glow intensifying until it burned my eyes. I could feel the heat now, scorching my skin, pulling me toward it like a magnet. And then, just as I reached the edge of the light, my fingers brushing against its warmth, the darkness swallowed me whole. I was falling. The ground beneath me vanished, and I tumbled into the void, the light fading, the shadows closing in around me like a crushing wave. I could hear Emma's voice again, distant but clear, calling to me, but it was too late. I was lost, falling through an endless abyss. When I finally hit the ground, it wasn't soft. It wasn't a landing. It felt like slamming into stone, and the impact rattled my bones. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might lose consciousness again. But I forced my eyes open. I was in a room, a chamber, perhaps. The walls were lined with strange symbols, ancient markings carved into the stone, glowing with an eerie light. And there, in the center of it all, was Emma. But it wasn't her. She was standing, her back to me, her body rigid, her hair dark and matted, her eyes glowing with the same unnatural light that filled the room. She turned slowly, her head tilting unnaturally to one side, her expression empty. "Emma!" I cried out, my voice trembling. "Please. It's me, it's Mom. What have they done to you?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes burning with an unnatural fire. And then she spoke, her voice not her own, but something deeper, something older. "You were too late," she whispered, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "They've already claimed me. You were never meant to save me." The world around me began to shift, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. I could feel it now, the pull, the power that had been building all this time. The creatures outside, the ones in the shadows, had been preparing, waiting for this moment. And then, with a final, chilling smile, Emma's form flickered, like a shadow in the wind. She was gone. And in her place, the darkness consumed everything. I was alone. And the shadows were closing in. The forest without traces. It was a quiet evening when I first heard the news. The old man at the local pub, eyes glassy and voice hushed, told the story like it was a whisper carried by the wind. A group of hunters, gone missing in the woods. No traces, no signs of a struggle. Just nothing. It had been days, and no one had found them. The only thing left behind were broken branches, and the unmistakable feeling that something was wrong with the forest. "Something unnatural," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder as if the trees themselves were listening. "The creatures out there, they can disappear. It's like they never existed. Or maybe they never left at all." I chuckled nervously, brushing the words off. Old men tell stories. Everyone knows that. But something about the way he said it stayed with me. I couldn't shake the image of those missing hunters, swallowed whole by a forest that had never seemed so dark, so alive. The next day, I found myself in the woods. I wasn't a hunter, but I was drawn there. Something about the woods had always called to me, like a strange magnet that pulled me deeper into its thick canopy. I couldn't explain it, but something felt urgent. It wasn't the missing hunters that drove me into the trees, but a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense that the truth was out there, hidden just beyond my reach. I entered the forest at sunrise, the early light breaking through the trees like fingers trying to grasp at something unseen. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, a familiar smell that always comforted me. But today, it felt wrong. The silence was unnerving. I walked deeper, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the undergrowth. Every now and then, the wind would rustle the leaves, but nothing else stirred. No birds, no animals. The woods were empty. The farther I went, the more the feeling of unease grew. It was subtle at first, like a shadow just out of sight. But then, I heard it. A soft, scratching sound, like claws dragging against bark. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening. My breath caught in my throat as I waited for the sound to return, but it was gone. For a moment, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But as I stood there, trying to steady my racing heart, I noticed something odd. The trees around me, once towering and solid, seemed to be leaning in, their gnarled branches twisting like fingers reaching out. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was being ridiculous. Nothing was out there. The old man's stories had gotten to me, that's all. I took a deep breath and started walking again. But then the noise came back. Closer this time. A soft, deliberate scratch. Like something or someone was moving just behind the trees. I froze again, every muscle in my body tensing. My eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for the source of the sound, but the woods were still. The silence was suffocating. I started to move forward slowly, trying to stay calm, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart pounded in my chest. It was like the forest itself was watching me. Suddenly, there was a rustling ahead. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I began to second-guess myself, thinking maybe it was just a deer or a rabbit, but then I saw it, a flash of movement. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but then it moved again, faster than any animal I had ever seen. It was tall, dark, and almost seemed to shimmer out of existence as it passed between the trees. My pulse quickened as I realized what I had just witnessed. It hadn't run like any animal I knew. It had disappeared in an instant. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I didn't know what it was, but I had seen something. Something that wasn't supposed to be in these woods. My mind raced as I turned back the way I came, the forest now feeling like a maze. Every tree, every rock, every shadow seemed to shift and change. The silence weighed on me, pressing down harder with each step. I didn't know what was out there, but one thing was certain, I had to get out before whatever it was found me. And then I heard it again. The scratching. Closer. My heart raced. I broke into a run, desperate to escape. The sound followed me, just out of sight, but always there. Always moving closer. Every tree, every rustle, felt like it was closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A flicker of movement, too fast, too unnatural. I was being watched. But what was it? What was lurking in the shadows of these woods? The answer was far worse than anything I could have imagined. I ran. There was no rational thought, no plan, just a primal instinct to flee. My breath came in sharp gasps, each inhale filled with the taste of damp earth and panic. The woods around me blurred as I pushed through the underbrush, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. But the scratching, it was still there. Every few steps, I would hear it, closer now, almost like it was keeping pace with me, following me. The sound of claws scraping against bark was relentless, rhythmic, as if whatever was out there had all the time in the world to play with its prey. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. But I could feel its presence, somewhere, just beyond my vision, lurking in the dark spaces between the trunks. Watching. The thought made my skin crawl, and I pushed myself harder. I wasn't even sure where I was going anymore. I just needed to keep moving, away from the source of that unsettling sound. I forced my thoughts to focus, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. Then I heard it, something different this time. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very air around me. It wasn't a wild animal. It wasn't a bear or a wolf. No, this was something deeper. Something older. My stomach twisted in knots. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I crashed through the brush, branches scraping my skin, the forest seeming to tighten around me. The growl echoed again, but now it was accompanied by a heavy, echoing footstep, something large and deliberate. It was real. Whatever was chasing me wasn't a figment of my imagination. And then, I saw them. Two gleaming eyes. They appeared in the darkness of the trees ahead, faint at first, like distant stars, but then they grew brighter, more intense. They burned in the night, reflecting a sickly, yellow glow. I froze. My heart stopped. I couldn't look away. The eyes were fixed on me, unmoving, like they knew exactly where I was. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. My legs trembled, but I couldn't run. I couldn't move. It felt as though my body had betrayed me, paralyzed by the sheer terror of those eyes. The growl rumbled again, now much closer, but I couldn't tear my gaze from the glowing orbs in the distance. I didn't want to know what they belonged to, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, my eyes followed the line of sight. The shape behind the eyes took form. It was there, tall, impossibly tall, standing perfectly still in the dark. Its outline was blurry at first, like a shadow on a foggy morning, but as I stared harder, it became clearer. A creature, half human, half something else entirely, its form too unnatural to be real. Its limbs were long, unnervingly thin, stretching far past what should have been possible. Its body was covered in dark, patchy fur, like something from an ancient nightmare, but its face, it was the face that truly terrified me. It was covered in sharp, jagged teeth, glowing eyes staring out from beneath a mass of dark hair that seemed to writhe, almost alive. The thing moved then, impossibly fast, like a snake slithering through the underbrush, its body contorting as it advanced toward me. I stumbled backward, shaking my head in disbelief. It couldn't be real. It just couldn't. But I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't just a wild animal. This wasn't some overgrown wolf or bear. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I thought I might scream, but the air caught in my throat. No sound came out. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my heart, faster and faster, as if it, too, was trying to escape. Suddenly, a crashing sound to my left. I whipped my head in that direction, just in time to see another set of eyes, glowing, yellow, intense, emerging from the shadows. Another creature, just as terrifying as the first, was moving toward me. There was no escape. I turned and ran again, but this time I knew it was too late. The woods, which had once felt like a place of safety, now felt like a prison. The trees pressed in on me from all sides, the air thick and suffocating. The growls and scratches grew louder, surrounding me, closing in. I was no longer alone. I was being hunted. The air grew colder. The further I ran, the colder it became. I could feel it in my bones, the chill that wasn't from the wind but something else, something unnatural, seeping into the very ground beneath my feet. It wasn't just the cold, it was the oppressive sense of dread that wrapped itself around me, tightening with every step. I stumbled, tripping over a root, and fell hard against the ground. My hands scraped against the dirt as I scrambled to push myself up. My breath came in ragged gasps, desperate and uneven. But there was no time to rest. There was no time to pause. The sounds of the creatures, the scratching, the growling, the footsteps, all of it was closing in. I forced myself to my feet, heart hammering in my chest, and looked behind me, half expecting to see one of those glowing eyes emerging from the darkness. But there was nothing. For a moment, I thought I had lost them, that I had managed to outrun whatever was chasing me. But then I heard it again. A faint rustle. Something moving just beyond my sight. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the trees. No, this was something else. Something that moved with purpose. And it was getting closer. I took off again, pushing myself harder, faster. My legs burned, my body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever again. I could feel their presence, like they were right behind me, right on my heels. I could hear their breath, their low growls, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. They were there. They were real. The shadows shifted in the corner of my vision, and I turned just in time to see something huge dart between the trees. A hulking figure, its eyes glowing, its fur matted and black, stretching toward me. The growl was deafening, and the ground shook beneath me. I didn't have to look back to know it was closing in. I could hear the sound of heavy paws thundering against the earth. I was its prey, and it was relentless. A scream rose in my throat, but I swallowed it back down. No. I couldn't let myself break. Not now. I had to think. The path ahead was nothing but trees, thick with underbrush, but I had no choice. I veered toward a narrow gap between two massive trunks, hoping for some kind of refuge, but the creature followed. I could hear its claws scraping against the bark as it squeezed through the same gap with ease, its movements unnaturally fluid, as though it was made for this. I pushed forward, my lungs burning, my vision narrowing. There was no way out. I didn't know how much time had passed since the chase began, but the exhaustion was starting to sink in. My body was betraying me, my muscles growing weak with every step, my thoughts slowing down, clouded by fear and panic. I needed to survive. I needed a plan. I darted left, trying to break the line of sight, but the growl sounded again, and this time it was much closer. Too close. I felt the creature's hot breath against the back of my neck, the hair standing on end as it reached for me, its claws outstretched. I twisted around, slamming into a tree with my shoulder, just as something large and cold brushed against my arm. It wasn't the creature, but something else, something sharp, something unnatural. I stumbled, caught off guard, but managed to catch myself before I fell. I couldn't stop. Not now. I had to keep moving. There was no sign of the others. The other creatures I had glimpsed, had they separated, or was I now alone in this nightmare? I didn't know, but I couldn't wait to find out. Every moment felt like an eternity, the silence between the growls unbearable. I pressed forward, ignoring the burning in my legs, the throbbing pain in my side, the terror clawing at my chest. It felt like I was being dragged deeper into the heart of the forest, into its dark, oppressive core where no light seemed to reach. The trees closed in on me as the world around me grew darker, colder. The stench of wet earth and decay filled the air, and my thoughts grew muddled. I could no longer hear the creatures, only the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. But then, a scream. Not mine. It was a human scream. A shrill, guttural cry that ripped through the silence, cutting straight through the fog of panic in my mind. I stopped dead in my tracks. Who was that? I strained my ears, listening, but the forest swallowed the sound, leaving only silence in its wake. My mind raced. Was I imagining it? Had I finally lost my grip on reality? Another scream. Closer this time. A man's voice, desperate, pleading. I didn't know what to do. Should I follow the sound? Or should I run as far away as I could, away from whatever horror awaited me? But before I could make a decision, the ground trembled again. I didn't have time. The growls returned, louder now, filling the air with an undeniable sense of danger. The eyes. They were back. I turned, but this time I wasn't sure which direction I was heading in. All I could do was run. Run, and pray I wasn't too late. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. The forest was a maze now, an endless expanse of trees, shadows, and rustling sounds that made my skin crawl. The ground beneath me seemed to shift with each step, as though it were alive, constantly changing, pulling me in different directions. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and decaying leaves, but it wasn't the earth that terrified me now. It was the dark figures moving in the periphery of my vision, the glow of their eyes burning brighter in the shadows. I knew they were watching me, tracking my every move. And still, the screams echoed through the trees. A man's voice, calling out in agony. Each cry sent a chill through me, a reminder that I wasn't the only one trapped in this nightmare. Someone else was here. Someone else was suffering. But the fear that had once gripped me was now a distant whisper in my mind, drowned out by the deafening sound of my heartbeat and the screech of claws scraping against bark. I couldn't let them get any closer. I couldn't let them catch me. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath me, and I stumbled, my foot caught on something hidden in the underbrush. I fell hard, the breath knocked from my lungs as I collided with the forest floor. My hands scrambled for purchase, but the earth seemed to shift away from me. I managed to push myself upright, but I could already hear the creature's heavy breathing behind me. The growl was so close now, I could feel it in my bones. It was right there. I didn't need to look back to know what was following me. I could feel it, as though it was part of the very air around me. The ground vibrated with every step it took. I had to move. I had to get away. I pushed through the underbrush, forcing myself through the thick, twisted trees that seemed to close in on me with every passing second. My body screamed in pain, exhaustion creeping into my muscles with each agonizing step. I could barely keep my balance as the forest seemed to shift underfoot. The shadows seemed to grow darker, and the silence between the growls was suffocating. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it. A clearing. A glimpse of moonlight breaking through the canopy above. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward it, the light offering a fleeting hope of escape, a momentary vision of safety. But the growl came again, louder now, almost deafening. The creature was right behind me. I reached the clearing, but as I stumbled into the open space, I froze. I hadn't expected this. The clearing was not empty. It was filled with them. Dozens of eyes. Glowing. Watching. I could see their forms now, standing at the edge of the light, just out of reach of the moon's pale glow. Some were small, their beady eyes shining like stars in the darkness. Others were larger, monstrous, hulking shapes, covered in matted fur, their teeth bared in hunger. They were the ones who had been chasing me. The ones who had been stalking the others. And they weren't alone. In the center of the clearing, a massive figure stood. The largest of them all. Its eyes burned red, glowing like coals in the dark. It was the one that had been leading the hunt. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my mind reeling. I was surrounded. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. I backed up slowly, my eyes never leaving the creatures that stood just outside the light. The air grew colder, the sounds of the forest disappearing, replaced by the low growls of the beasts around me. A sound broke through the silence, a voice. It was the man's voice again. The one who had been screaming. He was here, somewhere in the clearing. His cries were desperate, but they were not the cries of someone trying to survive. No, they were cries of surrender. And then, I saw him. He was on his knees, his eyes wild with terror. He was surrounded by the creatures, his body shaking violently. He seemed different. His skin was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though he was caught in some trance. Before I could even process what was happening, the creatures moved. They surged forward, their claws extended, their eyes focused on the man in the center of the clearing. He didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. They were going to take him. And then, just as suddenly, everything went quiet. The creatures stopped, frozen in place, their eyes shifting toward me. I didn't understand. But then, I felt it. A pressure in the air, a strange pull, as if the forest itself was alive. Something shifted deep within the shadows, and a figure stepped forward. It was different from the others. It was tall, too tall. Its eyes were not glowing. They were black, empty, soulless voids. It was watching me. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But I could feel it. The weight of its gaze. And then I realized. The hunt had never been for the man. The hunt had always been for me. And now, there was nowhere left to run. I couldn't breathe. The figure stood before me, its hollow eyes trilling into mine. It was taller than anything human, its form casting a monstrous shadow across the clearing. The creatures around me, who had been so hungry just moments ago, now seemed almost subdued. The air grew colder, and for the first time, I felt it, the utter and complete isolation. I was alone. The man in the center, the one who had been pleading for his life, was no longer moving. I didn't know if he had been taken, or if he had simply disappeared. It didn't matter. All that mattered was the creature in front of me, and the deathly silence that now filled the clearing. I took a step back, my heart pounding so loudly that it threatened to drown out the sound of the wind. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence creeping closer. Its very being seemed to distort the air, as though the forest itself was bending under its weight. My legs shook, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My mind was consumed by a single thought. This was the end. There was nothing else. I was just a prey to be hunted, a figure in the woods, waiting for the inevitable. A crackling sound broke through the silence. It was coming from the trees behind me. I didn't have to look to know what it was. The creatures were moving again, their steps heavy and deliberate, encircling me. Their eyes burned brighter now, reflecting the moonlight like an endless sea of fire. I was trapped. I couldn't stop myself from shaking. My mind raced, trying to find a way out. There had to be something, anything. But as I turned my head, I saw it. A figure. In the distance. It was impossible. A woman. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her pale face glowing in the moonlight. She was unlike anything I had seen before, her eyes wide and staring, her expression vacant. Her skin was too pale, too smooth, as though she didn't belong to this world. She didn't seem to care about the creatures that surrounded me. She was different. My breath caught in my throat as she stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was being guided by something I couldn't see. The creatures didn't react. They didn't even look at her. She was an enigma, an outsider to this world of darkness. I couldn't help myself. I stood up, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet, and I stumbled toward her. A desperate instinct pushed me forward. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse. She didn't respond. She only continued walking, her gaze locked onto me. And then, as I reached her, something snapped in the air. The figure, the tall, hollow-eyed creature, moved. Its long, twisted limbs stretched unnaturally, like it was breaking free of some invisible hold. I froze. It was coming for me. But the woman didn't stop. She didn't even look back. She kept moving forward, her steps sure, her eyes locked onto mine. She was going to leave me. She was going to let me face it alone. A sharp cry erupted from the creatures behind me. The sound was deafening. I spun around, but it was too late. The creature had already reached me. Its long claws wrapped around my arm, lifting me from the ground as though I weighed nothing. Its eyes were empty, dark voids, endless and consuming. I could feel its breath on my skin, cold and suffocating. And then, there was only darkness. The world fell away. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I couldn't. All I could do was wait for the inevitable. But then, nothing happened. The darkness remained, pressing in from every side. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear. There was only a presence, one that surrounded me, but didn't touch me. I was trapped, suspended in some twisted space between life and death. I didn't know how much time passed. Seconds? Hours? Days? It didn't matter. The terror that had once gripped me was gone, replaced by something far worse. An emptiness. A feeling of being forgotten. And then, I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. A gentle touch, like a whisper. I turned, and there she was, the woman. She was standing there, her expression unreadable, her eyes staring at me without a hint of emotion. "Come with me," she whispered. The voice was soft, calm, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. I didn't speak. I couldn't speak. But I knew. I knew what she wanted. She wasn't here to save me. I turned away from her, feeling the weight of her presence pulling at me. I couldn't let it pull me in any further. I couldn't let myself fall into whatever abyss she had stepped out of. But I couldn't run either. There was nowhere to go. Suddenly, the figure that had been looming behind me was gone. The creatures that had once circled the clearing were now nothing but shadows fading into the trees. The air was still. The moonlight shone down on the empty space where they had once stood. And yet, I could feel their presence. Their hunger. It was still there, lingering. The woman watched me, waiting for me to make a choice. But in the end, there was nothing left to choose. She was part of it all. Part of the darkness. And in the end, so was I. The Ghost of South Station. It was late in the evening when I stepped off the train at South Station. The platform was nearly empty, save for a few late-night travelers hurrying to their destinations. The air was thick with the lingering scent of oil and metal, a reminder of the station's age. As I walked through the echoing halls, a strange unease crept into my bones. Something wasn't right. I had taken this route many times before, but tonight felt different. The usual hum of voices, the occasional rustle of newspapers, and the tap of heels on the tiles seemed muffled, as if the station itself were holding its breath. I quickened my pace, eager to leave the cool night air behind, but a sudden sound caught my attention. It was faint at first, a shuffling, almost like footsteps in the distance. I stopped in my tracks, looking around. There was no one else nearby. I could see the shadows stretching long across the floor as the dim lights flickered above me. The sound grew louder, closer, now unmistakably footsteps. I told myself it was just the sound of someone walking in the distance, a trick of the acoustics in the old station. But then, it stopped. And in that silence, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I continued walking, my steps now quicker than before. As I approached the exit, I felt the weight of something watching me. A presence that didn't belong. I turned to look behind me again, but the platform was empty. No one was there. That's why I saw it. At the far end of the station, a figure appeared. It was an old man, hunched over, wearing the faded uniform of a station guard. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his face seemed wrong. Hollow, like something wasn't quite right. I froze. Something deep inside told me that I should run, but my feet wouldn't move. He began to shuffle toward me, slowly, dragging one foot behind him. His steps were dragging, and with each one, I could hear a faint scratching noise, like nails scraping against stone. The closer he got, the more my stomach churned. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound except for that horrible scraping. I knew his story, of course. The old guard. Everyone in the station knew it. A few years back, there had been an accident. The man had died in a crash at the tracks, the train derailing as it attempted to navigate a curve in the late hours of the night. But what people didn't know, what they didn't talk about, was that some of the workers said they'd seen him. Seen him walking around the station long after the accident, long after his death. They said the old man's ghost still haunted South Station, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. As he drew nearer, the station seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the scent of decay. I wanted to turn away, to run as fast as I could, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I felt like I was stuck in place, paralyzed by fear. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The old man's hollow eyes never left me, his movements slow and deliberate. Every few steps, he would stop, and I could see him turn his head slightly to the side, as if he were listening. For what? I couldn't say. The sound of his footsteps, those dragging, scraping steps, echoed through the empty station. The flickering light above me sputtered, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. The scraping grew louder. And then, as if on cue, the other noises in the station began to shift. I could hear faint murmurs, whispers, voices in the distance that I couldn't make out. My breath caught in my chest. I took a step back, then another, finally breaking free from the invisible grip that had held me. I spun around and began to run, my heart pounding, the echoes of the man's steps chasing me from behind. I didn't dare look back, not until I reached the entrance to the station. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the door handle, desperate to escape. Finally, it opened, and I stepped into the cool night air, gulping in a breath as if I had been underwater. But as I turned, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The old man was standing at the edge of the platform, watching me. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, his face expressionless. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from the terror, he vanished. In the blink of an eye, he was gone, as if he had never been there. I couldn't move for a long moment, my body frozen in place. Was it real? Had I imagined it all? I didn't know. But what I did know was that I could never go back to South Station again. Not after tonight. And as I turned to leave, I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper in the wind, something that sounded like a name, my name. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to tell myself that it had all been a figment of my imagination. The exhaustion from the late-night train ride, the tension of the empty station, maybe it all played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. I couldn't shake the memory of the old guard's hollow eyes, his dragging footsteps, and the eerie silence that enveloped the station the moment he appeared. I went to work as usual, trying to avoid thinking about South Station. I told myself that I had no reason to return. That night, I stayed in, the glow of the television offering a brief distraction. But as the evening wore on, a familiar unease began to settle over me. It was a feeling I couldn't ignore, as if something was drawing me back, tugging at me from the shadows of my mind. Against my better judgment, I found myself standing at the entrance of the station the following evening. I had convinced myself that it was just a station, just an old building with creaky floors and dim lights. There was no reason to fear it. But as soon as I entered, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. The station was eerily quiet, even more so than before. The usual hum of activity was absent. The platforms were deserted, and the distant sounds of trains arriving or departing seemed muffled, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the noise. I walked cautiously, the echo of my footsteps the only sound accompanying me. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound, just like before. It was coming from deeper inside the station, from the shadows near the tracks. I froze. For a moment, I wondered if it was the same trick of the acoustics, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. My heart began to race, and I instinctively glanced around, half expecting the old guard to appear once again. But there was no one. Still, the noise persisted, louder this time. It was unmistakable. The scratching grew into a low scraping, as if something heavy was dragging across the floor. I hesitated, torn between my curiosity and the overwhelming need to escape. But before I could make a decision, the air shifted. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and a cold chill ran down my spine. The shadows seemed to move, twisting and shifting in ways they shouldn't. I turned toward the sound, my body tense, preparing to run at the slightest hint of danger. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of movement, barely noticeable, but enough to make my pulse quicken. A figure, low to the ground, darting in and out of the darkness. For a moment, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it, a low, guttural hiss that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Something was there with me. Something that wasn't human. The scratching sound grew louder, closer, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just one thing. There were several of them, all moving in the shadows. I could hear the faint scrape of claws on the cold, hard floors of the station. I could feel the presence of something large, something unnatural, closing in around me. And then, I saw them. Huge, grotesque rats. No, they weren't just rats. These were something far worse. They were massive, their bodies bloated and twitching, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They scurried toward me, moving in a coordinated, almost deliberate manner. Their teeth were yellowed and jagged, glinting in the darkness as they drew nearer. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. Panic surged through me as I realized I had nowhere to run. The station was vast, but the walls seemed to close in, the long hallways becoming claustrophobic. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't even see them all. They were everywhere, their eyes flashing, their bodies rustling through the shadows. One of them moved closer, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It was the size of a small dog, its fur matted and patchy. I could hear its breath, shallow and rasping, as it advanced toward me. My mind raced, trying to come up with some logical explanation for what I was seeing. But there was none. These weren't normal rats. They were something far worse. In a panic, I turned and ran down the nearest hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My footsteps echoed through the station, but the sound of the rats' claws scraping against the concrete was louder, closer. I could hear them chasing me, their sharp breaths growing louder as they gained on me. I reached a stairwell and threw myself into it, racing up the stairs as fast as I could. But the rats followed, the sound of their claws scraping against the steps a constant reminder of their pursuit. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear their frantic scurrying growing nearer. At the top of the stairs, I burst through the door, out into the main hall of the station. I turned around to face the stairwell, expecting to see nothing. But instead, I saw them. The rats had made it up the stairs. They were watching me from the shadows, their eyes glinting with malice. And behind them, just barely visible in the dim light, was the figure of the old guard. He stood motionless, his pale, lifeless eyes fixed on me. His lips parted, and a low, groaning sound escaped him, almost like a whisper. "Get out," he rasped, his voice echoing in the silence. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted for the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't get out fast enough. The rats were still following me, their bodies skittering across the floor, their claws clicking against the tiles. I pushed open the door to the street and stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The station loomed behind me, silent and still. But I knew that something had changed. The air was thick with an eerie tension, and the darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Something told me that if I did, I would never escape. The next day, I stayed home. I couldn't bring myself to face the world again, not after what I had seen. The events of the night were etched into my mind, those glowing eyes, the rats, and the figure of the old guard. What was I supposed to believe? Was I losing my mind, or was something truly wrong with South Station? I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes in the darkness. The scratching sound echoed in my ears, persistent and relentless. It was as if they were following me, haunting me in my thoughts. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I needed to face whatever it was that had followed me out of the station. After hours of pacing, I made up my mind. I would go back. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my resolve, but I pushed it down. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't keep running from it. By the time I arrived at South Station, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty platform. The air felt thick, heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I approached cautiously, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the rats to be right behind me. But there was nothing. Just the eerie quiet of the station. I steeled myself and entered the building. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow on the cracked tiles of the floor. Everything was familiar, yet unsettling. It was the same as before, but something had changed. The station felt colder, darker, like it had shifted into another world, one I didn't understand. I walked toward the tracks, the echoes of my footsteps amplifying in the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and dust. As I passed the old ticket booths, I heard it again, the soft scratching. The same sound I had heard the night before. It was coming from the darkness of the tunnel ahead. I stopped. I couldn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. There was no rational explanation for what was happening. This wasn't just fear. This was something else. Something far worse. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was just the normal sounds of the station settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The scratching grew louder, closer. My pulse quickened. Then, just as before, the shadows seemed to shift. This time, they didn't remain still. They moved, like something alive, something that was watching me. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. The figure of the old guard appeared again, just at the edge of the platform. His pale, lifeless eyes locked onto mine, and for the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of recognition. A flash of something that might have been sorrow or regret. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. I backed away, but the rats, they weren't just in the shadows anymore. They were emerging, slowly, one by one, their massive bodies sliding across the floor like dark, twisted serpents. Their glowing eyes reflected in the dim light, and I could see their sharp, gnashing teeth. My throat tightened, but I couldn't scream. I could barely breathe. They were coming for me. They were closing in, their claws scraping against the floor in unison, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my feet pounding against the cold, hard tiles. I could hear them behind me, scratching, skittering, their bodies in hot pursuit. My breath was ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. The station seemed endless, the walls stretching out before me, the lights flickering like they were about to go out. I turned corners, ran through doors, and still, they followed. The old guard's voice echoed in my mind, "Get out." I didn't know if it was a warning or if he was the one commanding the rats, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to escape. Finally, I reached the exit, the door swinging open with a force I hadn't expected. The cool night air hit me like a slap, and I stumbled out into the street, gasping for breath. But when I turned around, the station was gone. It wasn't just that I had left it behind. The entire building had vanished. The familiar platform, the ticket booths, the tracks, everything was gone. In its place was nothing but darkness. Empty streets stretched out before me, as if the station had never existed at all. I stood frozen, my heart racing, staring into the void where the station used to be. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound in the distance. It was far away, but it was there, just beyond the edge of my hearing. I realized with a cold chill that I hadn't escaped. I hadn't left South Station. It had followed me. And the rats, they were still out there, waiting. I couldn't sleep that night. The silence of my apartment felt oppressive, a heavy weight on my chest that refused to let go. Every little noise made my heart skip a beat, creaks in the walls, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft flutter of a curtain in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond my vision. It wasn't the usual fear of being alone. It was something deeper, something darker, something that had followed me out of the station. I kept replaying the events in my mind. The old guard, his hollow eyes, and the rats, those grotesque, monstrous rats. They were all real. I had seen them. I hadn't imagined it. The station had changed, warped into something that wasn't meant to be, and whatever it wasn't finished with me. By morning, I had no choice. I had to go back. It wasn't a question of whether I wanted to. I couldn't explain it, but I felt this pull, this compulsion to return. Maybe I could find out what happened to the station. Maybe I could uncover the truth behind the haunting. I didn't know where to start. The station had disappeared the night before, leaving only an empty street. But I remembered the tunnels, the deep, dark tunnels that ran under the city. Perhaps, if I could find my way back there, I would discover what had happened and why it was chasing me. I took the subway to South Station, my hands trembling as I gripped the railing. The air felt heavy again, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stepped off the train. The station was gone. But the tunnels, they were still there. I could feel them beneath me, as if they were alive, breathing, waiting. The urge to go down there, to face whatever it was that haunted the darkness, grew stronger with each passing second. I walked to the entrance, the rusted metal door standing slightly ajar. The faint smell of decay and stale air wafted up from below, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. For a moment, I hesitated. But then I remembered the old guard, his eyes filled with sorrow, and the rats, those glowing eyes that seemed to pierce my soul. If I didn't go now, I fear I would never get the chance to learn the truth. I pushed the door open and descended into the dark. The tunnel was colder than I had anticipated, the walls slick with moisture. My footsteps echoed eerily, amplified in the silence. As I walked deeper into the abyss, I began to hear it again, the faint scratching sound. It was softer this time, but it was still there, just beyond my hearing. I strained my ears, listening intently. The sound seemed to be moving with me, following my every step. I paused and turned. Nothing. Just the long, narrow corridor stretching into the darkness. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it now, the presence, the thing that had been watching me all this time. It was close. I could almost hear its breath, slow and heavy, like a massive creature lurking just out of sight. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but I had no choice but to keep moving. It was getting harder to breathe, as if the air itself had thickened. And then, I saw them. The rats. A few at first, their glowing eyes flickering in the dark like stars in the void. But as I walked further, I saw more and more. Their eyes gleamed in unison, reflecting the light from my flashlight as they scattered across the floor, their claws clicking against the cold stone. I tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the path ahead, but I couldn't help but feel like they were closing in on me. The scratching sound grew louder, more intense, until it was almost deafening. Then I saw it. At the end of the tunnel stood the old guard, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He was standing motionless, just like I had seen him before, but this time his presence was different. There was no sorrow in his eyes now, only a deep, unsettling emptiness. His gaze pierced through me, and I felt my stomach turn. The rats, too, had stopped. They were still, their eyes fixed on me, their bodies tense, like they were waiting for something. The whole scene felt wrong, like I had stumbled into a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I took a step forward, and the guard moved. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand, as though warning me to stop. His lips parted, and I thought I heard him speak. But his voice was not human. It was a low, guttural growl, like the sound of the rats themselves. "Leave this place," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. It was as if I were paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The rats began to stir, their bodies shifting in the shadows, moving closer. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel my chest tightening. I was surrounded. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then, as suddenly as it began, the ground beneath me gave way. The tunnel split open, and I fell. I landed hard, the cold stone of the tunnel floor slamming into my back. Pain shot through my body, and I gasped for air, the breath knocked out of me. I scrambled to push myself up, but my limbs felt heavy, sluggish. The darkness around me pressed in, suffocating, thick with the weight of something ancient and wrong. I tried to focus, to steady my breath, but the sounds of the rats filled the air, scuttling in every direction, their eyes glowing like stars in the vast nothingness of the tunnel. The smell of decay was overpowering, clinging to the walls, the ground. The faint dripping sound echoed endlessly, a slow, rhythmic beat that somehow made everything feel worse. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. A figure moved in the shadows, tall and thin, its features distorted and warped. It wasn't the old guard this time. This figure was different. It was as if the darkness itself had taken shape, a silhouette made of shadows, shifting with unnatural fluidity. I could feel its presence, a cold, suffocating void that seemed to absorb all light and sound. The rats were silent now, watching this new figure, their glowing eyes fixed on it with eerie stillness. I tried to stand again, but my legs refused to cooperate. A surge of panic overwhelmed me, and I looked around, desperate for an escape. There was none. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, and I could hear the distant, indistinct echoes of movement, more rats, more creatures lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. And then the figure stepped closer. I could see it more clearly now. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, its body jagged, its arms long and thin, with fingers that seemed to reach out like tendrils. Its face was a blur of darkness, no features, only shifting shadows where eyes and a mouth should be. But it was watching me, no, it was looking inside me, as if it could see every fear, every doubt, every weakness. "You shouldn't have come," the voice came, a rasping whisper that seemed to come from all around me, from the very walls themselves. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused. The words echoed in my head, bouncing around like a drumbeat. You shouldn't have come. I could feel it now, the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting, perhaps for centuries, beneath this city. Something tied to the very foundation of the station, to the tunnel systems that ran under the streets like veins. The figure moved closer, and I could feel the temperature drop, the air turning cold enough to see my breath. The rats began to stir again, their bodies wriggling in unison, their eyes fixed on me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. They were waiting for something. For me? I couldn't bear the silence anymore. My mind was racing, my heart hammering in my chest, but I forced myself to speak, to ask the question that had been gnawing at me for days. What are you? The figure didn't answer at first. It only tilted its head, as if considering my question, then it spoke again. I am the guardian, it said slowly, its voice reverberating through the tunnel. The keeper of those who wander too far. Those who seek what they are not meant to find. I didn't understand. My head was spinning, my thoughts tangled in confusion. But before I could ask another question, the figure reached out, its hand long and skeletal. It was too close. I could feel the cold radiating from it, the air turning thick with an oppressive pressure. You have seen too much, it whispered. I wanted to scream, to run, but it was as though time itself had frozen. I couldn't move. The rats were moving again, crawling toward me, their eyes gleaming with an insatiable hunger. The figure leaned closer, its shadowy face coming so close I could feel its breath, cold and dry like the dust of centuries. You will be one of us, it said, its voice low, almost a hum. A part of the darkness that has lived here for so long. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The rats were at my feet now, crawling up my legs, their tiny claws scraping against my skin. I could feel them, their hot, slick bodies moving beneath my clothes, creeping closer to my face. I struggled, trying to pull away, but my body was not my own. It felt like the shadows were pulling me in, suffocating me. I had to escape. I had to. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, there was a flash of light. A brilliant, blinding light that cut through the darkness like a knife. The figure recoiled, its form writhing, twisting as the light consumed it. The rats scattered, their glowing eyes disappearing into the shadows. And then, silence. The light dimmed, leaving only the faintest echo of its presence. I was alone in the tunnel. The rats were gone. The figure was gone. But the air was still heavy, oppressive, as if it lingered, just waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling. The world felt different now, as if the very fabric of reality had shifted around me. The station, the tunnels, everything felt foreign, alien. I crawled to my feet, my body aching. I had to leave. I had to get out. But as I stumbled back toward the entrance, I heard it again. The faintest whisper, carried on the wind. You will return. And for the first time, I didn't know if I was going to make it out. Not physically, but mentally. The ghost of South Station, it seemed, had claimed another soul. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.